From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
I'm Betsy Peterson. I'm the director of the American Folklife Center, and I want to say welcome. We're really thrilled that you all are here. This is collections, collaborations, and connections. I guess every academic's sort of gathering must have alliteration somewhere in some title with a colon, so we're doing our best. But this is an event looking at the American Folklife Center at 40. And we're really thrilled to be having this opportunity to celebrate all of the good work of the American Folklife Center over the course of the whole year. This is the third of 3 symposiums that we've hosted over the last couple of years, examining various issues related to cultural heritage documentation and archival practice in this new century. And while we wanted to celebrate the work of the American Folklife Center and celebrate the collections of the American Folklife Center, we also want to do much more than that over the next 2 days. And in developing the agenda, the AFC staff working on the symposium, Nancy Groce, Guha Shankar, Nikki Saylor, and myself, we decided to highlight a handful of our collections with an emphasis on work developed since the AFC's founding in 1976, though that's by no means exclusively. As you can see from the large wax cylinder collections documenting Native American song from the turn of the 20th century all the way to our latest efforts to develop a digital folklore web archiving project. We also selected these collections with an eye towards inviting discussions about contemporary problems in archival practice and cultural heritage documentation. And for us, some of these problems focus on revisiting analog collections, wax cylinders, making them accessible in a new era. Some involve the thorny issues of working with born digital material and capturing emergent vernacular culture. Others involve very thorny issues of collaboration, authority, inviting multiple voices into the archives, and inviting multiple uses of our archives as we go forward. All of them require us to think about scalability and the scope of our work. I imagine these are problems all of us encounter every day in our work in some fashion. So we're looking forward to some very lively, challenging discussion. We hope you will think out loud with us. We do not see this as a symposium where we tell you about all the great work we do, although we'll probably do a little bit of that. But we want to identify issues. We want to brainstorm with you. We're looking forward to learning from all of you, and hoping that maybe, just maybe, over the next couple of days, we might identify a few ideas that will shape the work that we do in the next 40 years. So we are looking forward. We want to thank Library Services here at the library and the acting librarian, David Mao. Our new librarian will be arriving tomorrow and will be sworn in. So we're very excited about having Carla Hayden as the new Librarian of Congress. And then I also want to take a moment to thank all of the staff. I mentioned Nancy, who's done fabulous work, Guha, Nikki, Thea Austin, Steve Winick, Stephanie Hall, John Gold, and our fabulous sound man, John Reagan, and all of the volunteers. And I actually should say, to embarrass one of our very newest staff member, Kelly Revac, who just joined us a couple of weeks ago as a new processing technician. So welcome, Kelly. And now I'll turn this over to Nancy, who I know wants to make a few remarks about just issues. Logistics.
Yes, they shouldn't be issues, but just a couple of logistics. On the program, it says I'm Steve Winick. I'm actually not Steve Winick, but he's running a little late. So we will be in this room for the next 2 days. We hope you'll be able to join us for both days. We're right near the usual restrooms just outside the door to the left and right across from the cafeteria, which might be the best choice for lunch. This will be on a relatively short lunch break. We're going to try to run this as on time as possible. We know these always go a little bit longer, and we expect that it'll be a very interesting and productive day. We, as Betsy said, we want to encourage dialogue, both while people are up here and also during the breaks and at the reception. We hope you'll stay for the reception this evening. Also, if you haven't had enough, there are going to be some dinner parties going out to various places. Unfortunately, you'll have to buy your own dinner, but if you'd like to join one of 4 discussion groups that will continue on to dinner, there are sign-up sheets outside on the table as you come in, and please join me or my colleagues who are all going to different area restaurants to continue discussion and just to have a less formal chat. I'll be back, or probably Steve will be back during the day as masters of ceremonies to update you on various and sundry things. But for right now, I'd just like to thank you again for coming, to welcome you to the American Folklife Center and the Library of Congress, and to reintroduce Betsy. So Betsy, if you come up, and again, thank you.
Okay, hello again. Oh, okay, all right. Hello again. I confess I actually didn't fully follow the task that was set before me to prepare remarks about the challenges of the archives of the future. Or actually what I started doing was preparing remarks about the goal of providing the shifting context or backdrop of our work now and in the past 40 years, and then secondly, to talk a little bit about the shifts in our archival practice and goals. So with that, I think you'll see we're going to look at the trajectory of AFC's work in the past 40 years, but I think also challenges and opportunities will be identified and I think clearly evident. And as an illustration, in preparing these remarks, I went back and looked at some of the great material that's been written, particularly about the first 20 years of the center. And I went back and read some essays that the founding AFC director, Alan Abour, had written on the occasion of the 20th anniversary in 1996, and they're marvelous essays that are on our website. Steve Winick has also written about this period, as has Nancy Groce. But I also want to take a moment to introduce Alan Abour, the founding AFC director, who is sitting in our midst. This is a paragraph. It's from a piece called Building an Archives for the Future. Folklife Center celebrates its 20th anniversary. And he also sort of sets the context for that event. The 1970s was a period of increased attention to roots, those aspects of heritage that lie between the individual and the nation and that connect individuals to communities while defining the nation as a whole. This attention led to the passage of the American Folklife Preservation Act, Public Law 94-201, that passed both houses of Congress at the end of 1975 and was signed into law by President Ford on January 2nd, 1976. The definition of folklife in the American Folklife Preservation Act anchored the center firmly in the expressive culture of the family, ethnic, religious, occupational, and regional groups that make up America. I tried to think what that paragraph would be like in 2016, and it would be very different. And I think the shifts are striking, and I think the shifts will speak to some of these dramatic changes and some of the things that shape our work now going forward. And certainly, I think we see very dramatic shifts in attitude and a tempered belief in the national enterprise and democratic experiment that is the United States. I think there are shifts in expectations about government and civil society, citizen rights and responsibilities. I think there's a stronger push towards limited government and fiscal constraint. And these shifts have affected and continue to affect how we do our work, how we conduct field research, how we develop our collections, and they affect our access to resources. And I know Alan began to experience those constraints towards the end of his 20-year period here at the library. There's also been a shift from analog to digital, and the rise of the internet and the social media, of course, are critical. And the technology for documenting our lives and culture is much cheaper. There's more of it. It's available and accessible to all, and we can document most anything, anywhere, anytime. And these shifts make it possible for anyone to do professional quality documentation and approximate archival standards. And it puts into play all sorts of questions about professional knowledge, authoritative expertise, and it also allows us to begin thinking about access on a scale never before possible. And ironically, as it calls into question professional expertise, it also requires a whole new set of skills and expertise to deal with this work in the back end of things. Closer to our disciplinary foundations, there are shifts in ideas about community and individual. And in the 1970s, as you could see from that statement and the definition of folk life and the way it was portrayed, there was more emphasis on describing cultural or social groups in monolithic or static terms. And in the intervening years, there's been a greater acknowledgement in anthropology, sociology, folklore, most any place you look, in the agency of the individual and the evolving processes of forging individual identity. The shift from group to individual has almost moved from individual towards group. These shifts affect how we think about folk culture today. They affect how we think about cultural communities and individual creativity. And it affects the type of collections we develop. Oral history collections have always been a part of the archive, but are increasing in number and significance as a part of the archive. And the Veterans History Project and the Civil Rights History Project, both are congressionally mandated projects are recent examples, and I can't believe I'm talking as much as I am. I've just gotten my warning. From the AFC's beginnings, Alan, with Carl Fleischhauer, who is also in our midst and was the first staff member hired here at the center, I know both of them saw a direct linkage to the Archive of Folk Song, which was founded by the library in 1928. And in fact, the AFC was placed at the library in part because the Archive of Folk Song existed here. The archive eventually merged with AFC beginning in 1978, and it is still the heart of AFC, I think. But the archive had a legacy of initiating field research, sending government workers out, solo or as part of larger federal projects, such as the WPA. And in the first 10 years of the center, this was a large part of the work that the center did. And while they were continuing in a tradition, they were also adding to it. And they were developing team-based approaches to field research, and the material was much broader in scope. While I think the earlier material was much more sort of item-oriented, focusing on getting those songs, getting those stories, this field work was much more focused on documenting a broad range of cultural tradition in everyday life. And visual documentation became very central to the process and has only continued to grow and be a presence as much as our audio material. In the late 80s, federal budgets shrank, field surveys decreased in size and number, and programming started becoming more critical. And I'm almost done, I promise. Alan has remarked that in that period there began to be a shift towards working with the collections that existed. And I think the Federal Cylinder Project and the work that is continuing to be done to bring that work into the 21st century is one great example and a very successful example of that. When Peggy Bolger came to the archive and the Folklife Center in 1998, she began to shift some of the collections development for the Folklife Center. And again, I think fiscal constraint, limited government begins to come into play into that equation, and began to acquire collections either through donation or through purchase from individuals such as Alan Lomax, John Cohen, Bruce Jackson, Margaret Mills. And she also began to develop long-term agreements with nonprofit organizations, such as StoryCorps, the International Storytelling Center, the National Council for the Traditional Arts, and more recently, the Center for Traditional Music and Dance. And as Steve Winick has commented in a blog, this led to an explosion in the quantity of documentation in the archive without a sacrifice in quality. And since 1976, the archive has grown from approximately 450,000 items to a current figure of about 6 million. And that does not include the Veterans History Project as part of that. So where do we find ourselves today? I think you're going to hear about some of the work that we're doing. We see ourselves very much as part of a great lineage, stretching back to 1928, building on the work of Alan and Carl, Peter Bartis, Mary Hufford, and many others. And we also find ourselves in a time of fiscal constraint, technological change. The nature of the staff is changing. The nature of our work continues to evolve. We will continue to grow our collections primarily through donations and occasional purchases. But that's going to allow us to bring in a whole bunch of voices that have never been heard, a whole bunch of different perspectives that may not be amidst the staff. And I think we'll provide a fuller picture for what we do. I think Veterans History Project, Civil Rights History Project have allowed us and allowed the federal government to maintain some sort of presence and I hope validation in vernacular culture. But going forward, that will be a larger, I think, kind of picture. And I'm excited about that. I also think the technological change, while sort of being disruptive, as people like to say in many ways, it is also going to open up incredible opportunities for us to think about scale, not only scale in terms of what we can share online, but scale and collaboration in a way that we've never been able to tackle before. And that's very exciting to me, and I think to the rest of the staff here. And with that, I will stop. But thank you again, and thank you for coming. We're very excited, and I'll turn it back over to Nancy.
Okay, hi, I'm Nikki Saylor. I'm head of the archive at the American Folklife Center. Thank you all for making time to come out to talk with us today. Is happening. And so we are trying to figure out how to be responsive to that, what it means to create a research collection that will be meaningful for years to come. So we've invited 2 archivist librarians and 2 folklorists who do research online to talk a little bit about what they do and then put them in discussion about the issues. So I would encourage you to look at their full bios online, but I will just mention the order here. We've got Abbie Grotke. She is the head of the web archiving team at the Library of Congress. She has enabled us to start a modest and problematic, apparently, collection, which you'll hear more about, documenting expressive cultures, which was actually a partnership with Trevor Owens, who's no longer at the library, but he took the lead on that for us, so shout out to Trevor. And then next you'll be hearing from Andrea Kitta at Kitta from East Carolina University, and she's associate professor there, and she has a PhD in folklore from Memorial University, and she does all kinds of research on medical folklore and what have you. So then we will hear from Bergis Jules, and he is at University of California, Riverside. He also happens to be the PI on a grant called Documenting the Now, which is looking at sort of technologies and ethics around social media archiving. Okay. And then we have Montana Miller, and she is associate professor at Bowling Green State, and she has a PhD in folklore from UCLA and does all manner of research online, and is also involved in IRB issues related to internet research. So I'll hand it over to Abbie.
Okay. Waiting for my slides to come up. Should I stand up there?
You can do whatever you want. This is free form. You can sit if you'd like.
No dancing.
Yeah, you can see what's happening.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. I'm going to talk a tiny bit, we don't have much time, but I'll talk a little bit about our web archiving program and how we got, or some of the challenges we're facing with our web cultures web archive. So the library has been archiving web content since 2000, and we started, like most national libraries do, with US elections. We're still archiving US elections, which is very draining sometimes, but so I'm excited today to talk about something that's not government and election content. So we kicked off our archiving with sort of pilot programs, and then quickly became a production outfit when we started documenting the events of 9/11. So that's been on our minds the last few days. And that's one of our earliest web archives, where we were trying to document the expressions and output of citizens and organizations and just the reaction of the community that was unfolding on the web at that time. So we have a minimal amount of our collections available through the library's website. That's one of our challenges that I'll talk about in getting collections online. We currently have about 25 active ongoing collections that we're working on. There's about 90 that we've done. We take a thematic and event-based approach to archiving, so we don't have the legal authority to archive all of the US web. We can't even define what the US web is. So unlike some of our National Library colleagues who can archive all of the Icelandic domain or the French domain, we don't have that luxury. So we do select content. And my team is responsible for managing the overall project and activity and the workflow. The selecting of the websites and the development of the collections come to experts like Nikki, and when Trevor was here, he helped us out as well. So that's sort of the quick overview of what we're doing. Here's the description of how the Web Cultures web archive was proposed to us. And we have a little proposal form that people have to fill out to sort of think about the types of content that they might select for the archive. How that actually plays out when they come to select the content, it can depend on a number of factors. I won't spend time reading that, but basically the idea is to capture vernacular sites that aren't official channels. So some of these, I'll show some examples that will help. So we began crawling this content in April of 2014. 49 sites or URLs were nominated for archiving. We have crawled 33 of them. We're crawling most of those still. There are a few that have gone away since then. 16 of those have not been crawled for permissions reasons. We have to ask explicit permission of the site owners to archive their content. I could spend a whole hour or two talking about our extensive permissions policies here, but I won't. But 13 of those did not respond to the permission request. So if they do not respond, we cannot archive, which can be unfortunate. 2 sites denied permission to crawl, so we were not able to collect those sites. And then a few others we did not archive for other reasons. So some of the biggest challenges, again, are the permissions responses. There are a number that we attempt to contact site owners 3 times. And if we don't hear from them after a year, we give up unless we find another contact email to try. But not hearing back means we don't preserve that content, so that content is lost and potentially creates skewed collections or just confusing, why wasn't that site archived instead of that site. Getting access to researchers has been sort of a painful process for all of our web archives. We have, if you're familiar with the Internet Archive and how they collect and show websites through the Wayback Machine, is everybody generally familiar with that? Hopefully. So websites are crawled over time, so multiple captures over time, and then you have to use a viewer to click around the website and view the dates of capture. We have that sort of simple access. Other types of access for researchers, including cataloging of the records, has not happened for this particular collection. We don't have bulk data sets that are available for download for researchers, which is the way that a lot of people are interacting with web archives these days. Other challenges are around crawling the sites, and I'll show some examples, but some of these are very large sites where content is not really deleted very often, so it just builds up and builds up. Crawling them has been a lot more complicated than we had anticipated. We had been used to crawling relatively small sites that were pretty easy to collect, and these have created other challenges. And some of those challenges have been resolved by some new techniques for crawling. We are doing some deeper, longer crawls of some of these sites so we can get more of the deep buried content that's hard if you're just going back once a week or once a month. We're also crawling RSS feeds if we can find them. So we're doing that twice a day for some of these sites. So we're able to get frequent changes to the site that's being published out in an RSS feed, in addition to the deep quarterly crawls. So that's helped us improve results. We've been a little bit short-staffed. We've recently hired a few more people who we're hoping to spend some time analyzing the results of these. So just some examples from the archive. Emojipedia is one of them. Let's see. Nikki is our expert in why some of these sites are selected, so I won't go into the reasons why, but this one decodes the meanings and definitions of emoji characters, providing insight on the vernacular meaning of the characters. So a lot of these sites, another challenge is that interacting with the live site is very different from the archive site. Some of these have search functions that aren't replicated in the archive. So unless this one has a nice browse by category, that will replicate in the archive. But if you actually wanted to search the original website, you can't do that the way that we're currently capturing this content. So browsing is very important. Oh, I'm out of time. I didn't get my 2-minute warning. Oh, I missed it. I'm sorry. Can I go one more minute? Okay. So we have Lolcat Bible. I won't read the descriptions of these. I'll just show you some examples. Metafilter is another example where it's a very deep, heavily changing site. So we're using that new crawling strategy for that. Mudcat.org, I believe, is a music. Mudcat Cafe. That's another one where we've had to crawl in multiple different ways, and we're trying to piece together the results of that to see how successful it is. FARC is very difficult because a lot of it's related to outbound links. So if you're familiar with FARC at all, it's a lot of comments about external links. We are not getting those external links as a part of the archive because of our permissions policies and other restrictions. You're the man, dog. You're the man now, dog. Created lots of problems in our archive. Every page on this site is a separate subdomain. So crawling that was terribly intense, and we had to figure out how to crawl it in a slightly different way. You can also see there's some formatting problems with some of the not in archive content with this one. And that's it. There's my emojis. Thanks. Did anyone else have?
Andrea? No. Is it me next?
Yes. Yeah. Oh,
thanks. Hey. Wait for my presentation to come up. So I'll start with just by saying one of the things I really kind of love this quote. Lynn McNeil in her TEDx talk actually referred to the internet as the world's largest unintentional folklore archive. And I think that's a great quote for that, especially the unintentional part. I don't think when people put things on the internet, they necessarily intend for those things to be kept forever. We think of it as a very volatile media. For example, right up here I have my Twitter handle and the hashtag folklore and folklore Thursday. I didn't actually know if we had a hashtag for this conference.
We should.
We should have a hashtag. We can make one up right now if you
I'm
want.
looking at Jesse. AFC 40?
Yeah, that's actually, I was going to suggest AFC 40.
Yeah,
so there you go.
AFC 40.
So if anybody's live tweeting, there
Go
you
with
go. So all of these things, we don't necessarily think of them as being necessarily permanent, but we are starting to archive these things, and maybe that's not what people's original intentions were. I'm one of those people that studies urban legends, so I look a lot at those kind of things and what's happening. And one of the interesting things with urban legends is no matter what, they always, everything old is new again with these. So, oh, that didn't work out so well. So a lot of these legends are very old, but we're now seeing these sort of versions of them with pictures. With the text underneath. That's easier to share on Twitter, of course, where you have only 140 characters. So people are creating these things online. So we have on the left, sorry, on my left, yeah, that's your left as well. We have a fairly classic urban legend, especially with the children's handprints. And then we also have the vanishing hitchhiker, but we have an old version of it. We have one from World War II here, which of course it's even older than that. But this one is starting to make the rounds. When I did a quick Google search on urban legends, which is, more common than contemporary legends for a lot of people, which probably upsets some folklorists. I saw that right away we have this version from World War II that I have not heard in years. But there it is on the web, all over the place, and it comes up rather quickly. So it's pretty interesting. This is one of the versions where the vanishing hitchhiker actually tells them when the war will end. And I have not heard that version in years from my students or in oral tradition anywhere, but here it is on the internet. So that's interesting that's one of the ones that has kind of come up. One thing I do hear a lot about from my students are creepypasta. So for those of you who have, oh sorry, I also forgot to mention the technology legends are changing over time too. So those of you who grew up with the whole notion that you were going to get cancer from your microwave or for sitting too close to the TV, it's now your cell phone. So we have a mobile radiation penetrating your brain. I also don't ever recommend Googling the terms creepy baby monitor unless you don't ever want to sleep again. This is a very common one that has come up more recently where we have a lot of people, because there was at one point people were hacking into baby monitors and creeping people out. But now there are all these ghost stories about people seeing things like this terrifying picture on their baby monitors. So this is these are new legends about technology, the newer technology, but they're the same as the old legends that we've had in the past. They're just about something different now. They're about cell phones instead of microwaves. So it's kind of, everything is kind of keep changing. Now these creepypastas, for those of you who are not aware, this is a very widely used website, especially among people who write fan fiction. So we have a whole host of terrifying characters, including one of my favorites, Slender Man, up there on the upper right. I write quite a bit about Slender Man, and some of you might be aware of him because of the Slender Man stabbings that happened in 2014. So my students are coming in and they want to know, what are the precedents for Slender Man? What are the precedents for the Rake? What are the precedents for these other characters? And of course, in the bottom corner there, we have the clown. Which those of you who are not aware, there is an outbreak, an epidemic, dare we say, of clowns in North Carolina right now, of them just showing up and standing there creepily. And a lot of issues are coming up about this. It's becoming a safety issue as well. So this is getting to be pretty interesting to see how these change. Now, clown stories have been around since at least '81, with people having creepy clown stories. So this is not anything new by any means. In some ways, this has really made our jobs easier. We can sit at home and look at this stuff on the internet in your pajamas, and you don't have to go anywhere or do anything. Of course, there are some problems with doing it this way. And one of the big problems I face, because I work a lot with medical information, I work a lot with the vaccination, anti-vaccination and pro-vaccination movements, and how people share that information online. It's medical information. Right, so the internet has been wonderful for people with disabilities, especially those who are not able to easily access places. They can use the internet, they can share with online communities, especially if they have a chronic condition. It's wonderful for those reasons. Wait, I'll get you, you don't have to have that staring at you anymore. I started realizing people kind of kept shifting over. So all of this information that's out there on the internet is wonderful to have, but we don't necessarily know all the context. So people will share things on the internet, but we don't know why they're sharing them or what they mean to them if they don't put any of that context down. So when we don't get the full context, are we doing proper field work? I'd say we're not. And this is especially true with medical information, especially when we start to look at how people are sharing medical information. So when they're sharing this stuff, I don't think they always know exactly to what extent they're doing. So I thought I'd just show you very quickly. If I type in Google, anti-vaccine and Facebook, which is something I frequently do, the first thing I get is the vaxtruth.com's Facebook page, which I clicked on. This is it. I decided, well, let's just see, just for fun, what if I click on to see who liked the first article? These are all the names of the people who liked that first article. I've blocked them out so you can't see them. So then I just clicked on the first person. There's her name. There's a picture of her child. There's a picture of her dog. There's her picture. There's all of her friends. I can send her a message. Her school and career, she's a nurse, by the way. Very interesting for my research as someone who's interested in the anti-vaccination movement. And there's also her husband's name. Scrolling, that's on just the beginning part of that page. Wonderful information, wonderful context. Can I ethically use it? I say no. Even though it is public information, she has publicly posted all of these things, I don't feel it's ethical for me personally to use this. Scrolling down slightly, I also know her child's name. I know her dog's name. I know everything about that. I could probably figure out her passwords if I really wanted to, based on that information, since people tend to use children's names, dogs' names, those kind of things as passwords. This I don't think is ethical at all in a lot of different ways, but you know, how do we figure these things out? How do we decide what we use in our research and what we don't use? That gets very, very complicated on what we can use and what's ethical for us to use, especially in the case of we are talking about vaccinations. So this is her child's health information, not hers. What happens in 20 years when her child goes to school, goes to university, and they find out they're unvaccinated because they looked at his mom's website? So now we're talking about medical information. So I just wanted to kind of end with saying that, you know, privacy and consent is very important in all of these situations. Just because we can find it, maybe we shouldn't find it. But the internet really provides us with some great opportunities to find this information online and gives us access for people who don't normally have access. But we have to think about how we do this ethically, morally. What is our role of folklorist? How do we define that for ourselves? It's conversations we need to have, and I think this is a great place to have them. Thank you.
I don't have any slides.
Okay.
Yes.
Slides.
I don't have slides, but
Okay.
Oh, okay.
all right. So I'll, since in the interest of time, I'll talk briefly about a project, a specific project I'm involved with, and why we did it, and some concerns we have as we're getting the work done. So I'm one of the principal investigators on a project called Documenting the Now, and we're building a social media archiving tool that we're calling DocNow. This is a partnership project with Washington University in St. Louis and also the Maryland Institute for Technology and the Humanities. My other two PIs are Ed Summers, who is the lead software developer at MITH in Maryland, and Chris Freeland at Washington University. This work started a couple years ago with Ed Summers and I. This project was really inspired by the events following the killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri in August 2014. And you know, the millions of images that we saw being shared on Twitter and other social media spaces, millions of videos, personal stories about that event and what it led to. So we saw these millions of expressions of sort of publicly accessible expressions of grief, of anger, of criticism, of support. And you know, Ferguson is what really led to what we now know as, is what it gave life to what we know as the Black Lives Matter movement right now, right? Which is a movement that sort of brings more attention to mass incarceration, police violence in poor communities, among other things. And so, you know, we were at the Society of American Archivists conference during the week that Michael Brown was killed, and it was basically a bunch of archivists sort of sitting around watching these events unfold on social media and thinking about ways that we could help, you know, our peers collect this information, build documentation, build collections around this type of very rich content that was being shared. And so we decided to start doing several projects around collecting different hashtags around killings that were happening, that happened over the past 2 years. We had Walter Scott, we had the Charleston shooting, we had Sandra Bland. All these different types of events had their own life online, and they were really sort of playing out on social media, which is the first place that people would go to find out about what was happening. And we had people really close to the ground, really close to the event, really close to the people, family members, getting online and telling their stories in sort of these unmediated ways, right? So we wanted to think about ways to get archivists and researchers sort of plugged into that content, and think about ways to do that easily for them. So DocNow is basically a project to build tools that archivists could use to easily, and easily is really important here because there are a lot of tools available right now to do this work that don't, that require sort of this high level of technical skill to really get into and really use to sort of capture the data and make any sense of it. So what we're doing is we're building something that folks, without any technical skills could just sort of tap into and start making some sense out of this sort of vast amount of data, right? Millions of tweets in some cases. So building tools to capture that data, to export metadata, to export digital content like videos and live streams and images. And we're also building tools for researchers. Researchers are our second main audience for this project. And we're interested in building tools that can help researchers make sense out of this vast amount of data, and also to share that data back and forth, because there are a lot of restrictions from the platforms themselves about how you can share the data with other people, right, that they create, because sort of data reselling is also a business model for a lot of these platforms. We do have some concerns as we've been doing this project. We're a very transparent project. We do a lot of our sort of development very open. We have a Slack channel with almost 200 people in it that anyone here can join and sort of jump in the conversation around social media archiving, social media research. We have our Twitter account where we share information and have back and forth. We have a blog. So we really believe in sort of being transparent about this type of work. And I think we're really one of the first projects to do that type of development, software development around this particular issue in this way. And it's been really beneficial to us because we're getting all this feedback from so many people, and we actually take this feedback and put it back into the work that we're doing. And a lot of the concerns that are consistently being brought up are around ethics, right? And why or how we should be doing this type of work. And so one of the main concerns is around ownership of content, right? Who actually owns the content that's being shared via social media? So Twitter, for example, says that you own your content, but because you're using their platform, you're giving them sort of this exclusive right to reuse your content, right? They say that you own it. They have rules around how other people can use it. And so, one of the questions we have is how should archivists sort of operate in this space, right? How do you seek consent, for example, or should you seek consent if you're building an archive of tweets where you're using a hashtag or where you're using a keyword and you're not necessarily focused on a particular person? So how do you navigate those really murky waters around ownership of content? 2 minutes, okay. And consent, right? As far as consent goes, most content creators don't know that we're building these archives of social media data, right? And so, when you post something online, you may post it in one context. An archive may take it and keep it in a repository for 15, 20 years, and someone else may reuse that content in a completely different context. So do we owe it to content creators to really respect sort of the original intent of their material that they posted online? So these are just some of the issues that we're trying to grapple with, and thinking about ways to sort of build functionality within the tool that may be able to address some of those issues. There's also the issue of surveillance, all right? So law enforcement at every level in the US is using tools to monitor social media activity. This happens at the local police level, the FBI, the CIA. I mean, the CIA has a funding arm, In-Q-Tel, that one of the things they invest in is companies that do social media mining specifically. And so how do we build collections that don't sort of support this kind of activity, right? So let's just say, companies like In-Q-Tel or funding arms like In-Q-Tel don't exist. The companies they fund don't exist. And the CIA is like, well, Library of Congress has all the tweets that were ever collected. Let's tap into that, right? So how do we sort of think about how to protect people that are represented in those data sets from this type of activity? And a more general concern I have is really the lack of diversity in the web archiving and social media space. Frankly, it's a very white space, the people who build tools around social media archiving, web archiving, and we have to think about what that means for the type of content that will be saved for the future.
Great.
All right.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Montana Miller. Can you all hear me okay? So it seems like there's an interesting mix here of archivists and researchers, and archivists who work with researchers and vice versa. I'm a folklorist and a researcher, but I've also, since the beginning of my academic career, been very interested in IRB issues, which is human subjects research protections. And since I began working at Bowling Green State University, I've also been serving on the HSRB, or the IRB there. And I've also had the opportunity to be involved in Primer, which is the national organization that teaches IRB members how to review proposals, and especially in the role of kind of bringing them into the internet age and kind of educating them about the specific dilemmas and boundaries and issues that come up with internet research. So I wanted to kind of outline some of those issues and read you a small passage from my chapter in Trevor Blank's book. This is Folk Culture in the Digital Age. I wrote the last chapter to this book, which is about doing fieldwork on Facebook as a folklorist and the issues that come up with that. This came out in 2012, so it's not completely outdated yet. That's the problem with publishing on anything internet related. Of course, it's immediately outdated. So I consider a major role for me, one of my purposes as a folklorist, is to kind of bridge that gap between IRB members and folklorists, because there's a lot of misunderstanding and fear on both sides. And it's also complicated because not every folklore program is bothered by IRBs. Like when I went to UCLA, the IRB didn't want anything to do with the folklore department. We didn't have to worry about it. However, at many universities now, folklorists are part of the larger social science contingent that does have to go through IRB review. So the idea that now we are kind of mining and harvesting huge amounts of folklore material that's available to us on the web, it's so tempting, and yet it does present a lot of issues which I think every other panelist has very sensitively addressed. And so I just want to go over some of them. The whole concept of privacy has changed so much and is continuing to change. And I think that maybe some of you have heard of Dana Boyd. She's a well-known researcher who studies teenagers and their attitudes toward privacy and their social media behaviors. She talks about how teenagers don't worry anymore about whether what they're posting is private or not, because they kind of know that privacy doesn't even exist anymore. It's not really even possible to have privacy. Anything that you post could be seen by anyone. So instead of worrying about the content and keeping that private, she has found that instead they've developed coded systems of communicating so that, yeah, anyone might be able to see what I posted, but they won't know what it means. So an example of that she writes about is subtweeting. Has anybody heard of subtweeting? A couple people? Okay. So I'll just go to the Urban Dictionary definition of a subtweet.
We're archiving that too.
The top definition of a subtweet is a tweet. You all know what a tweet is, right? A message posted on Twitter that mentions a Twitter member without using their actual username, usually employed for negative or insulting tweets. the person you're mentioning won't see the subtweet in their Twitter timeline as it doesn't contain the @ symbol that every Twitter username has. But even more than that, maybe you've heard the term vague booking. It's when somebody posts a status update like, oh, I just can't believe that asshole did that. And that's all they write. And you want to know desperately what they're talking about, but if you're not in that insider circle, you're not going to know. And how much use would that kind of material be to a folklorist who's gathering material? There's no context, as you were talking about. So in a way, the protection for the new generation that knows that privacy no longer exists is to use subtweets and vague booking and to make the context so indecipherable that it's really useless information to anyone that they don't want to understand what they're communicating. Okay, so coded communication, we could call that, including subtweets. Of course, what is public space and what is private space is so much a matter of perception these days. And one thing that I really cover in my chapter in Folk Culture in the Digital Age is that before you even do your field work, and especially before you present your proposal to the IRB and try to get them to pass it, you have to really know your population and know what their perceptions of private and public are. Often the IRB is concerned that you may be invading these people's privacy, but in fact you know that they completely are aware that people could be looking at their stuff, and they're okay with it. So you need to be able to show that and to know it yourself. So I always advocate to all of my students and other researchers in folklore that before you just dive into a project, spend some time there, get to know the patterns and get to recognize the clues that people certainly give out as to whether they realize that their stuff is being watched. For example, I observed a chat room for several years in which it was regularly mentioned that there were probably journalists and researchers observing the whole thing. Well, if that's regularly mentioned in that community, you can't really be a member of that community for very long without getting the message that, journalists go there to get ideas for stories, and researchers are probably writing, honors papers on this. And everybody who was sort of an integral member of the site seemed to know that. Passivity and consent, you mentioned this, Abbie. If you didn't hear back with permission to crawl, then you weren't able to crawl. I wasn't familiar with the term crawl, but that's great. It's got that same imagery as like harvesting, and we just need to be really careful about that. So the perception of private and public, generally we've relied on, what does a reasonable person expect? Does a reasonable person reasonably expect to be able to behave without being recorded and regarded? These distinctions are definitely changing, especially when we consider these big data environments. And I encourage you to look up Michael Zimmer, who writes a lot about these issues, especially when it comes to big data like OkCupid and the study they came out with, Twitter, Facebook. I've worked with him at Primer and served on many panels with him. And he's not a folklorist, but he's very savvy about these computer issues. So that is Michael Zimmer. Knowing your field before the harvest, I've mentioned that before, getting to know your population and what their perceptions are. This interesting dilemma of whether something is oral expression or textual archive, because IRBs consider that something that's already published, you have the right to use it. However, something that is emerging constantly, like Twitter or Facebook, where people are actually spouting it out as though it's an oral phenomenon, and then instantly becomes archived, published material. What do we consider that? IRBs are extremely confused about that issue. And if I may just read this passage, it will get to this idea about shoulder to shoulder. So, when researchers first began flocking to the internet to observe chat room discussions, blogs, and the like, it was somewhat easier to distinguish between public and private spaces online. Debates sprang up about communities where public access seemed ambiguous, such as listservs, and topics that were especially sensitive, such as vulnerable or stigmatized groups. But it was easier to determine what a subject's reasonable expectation of privacy would be, and then weigh the risks of using that data, the risks to the individual, and the risks to the community being studied. Folklorists must now consider the risks and ethically navigate the new internet terrain for our fieldwork, because there is so much important cultural behavior occurring in this space. Jumping through the bureaucratic hoops of institutional review boards is certainly infuriating, as it seems like there are folklorists all over Facebook and other social networks and discussion boards throwing questions out there and reaping abundant harvests. At this writing, increasing numbers of us are Facebook users ourselves, sharing our research and our lives as academics and humans. More than ever before, both online and offline, with the boundaries dissolving all around us, we stand shoulder to shoulder with the folk whose traditions and meanings we explore and interpret. So that phrase, shoulder to shoulder with the folk, is something that I heard folklorist John McDowell say in his 2008 Archer Taylor Memorial Lecture at the Western States Folklore Society meeting. And I've always thought that was a great encapsulation of our ethics as folklorists, is that we don't hold ourselves above our subjects, but we are right in there with them, advocating for them, authentically representing them. And we need to find a way to apply that to the internet world as well. Thank you.
Right, there's a lot there. Thank you all so much. We can open the floor to some questions. Surely there are some. I don't know who has the, you've got the mic, okay.
Test? Okay. Hi. I really appreciate the different mentions of ethics and fieldwork by the panelists, and I wondered if anyone wanted to talk a little more about the aspect of, for example, we do web archiving here at the Library of Congress, the aspect of embedding your own personal or the institutional orientation towards those issues into the data that has been collected. Because one thing I've noticed with the way we do web archives here is that all those decisions are made outside of the web archive and not, excuse me, directly included. Not meaning to criticize the library overly, but in general, I think one of the great benefits that folklore brings to scholarship is its attention to these details.
Who wants to take that?
Well, I mean, I have something to say. I don't know if it'll answer your question. A couple of weeks ago, so we have a pretty stellar advisory board for our Documenting the Now project. We have scholars, archivists, librarians, journalists, I think about 22 people on the advisory board. And so we had our first meeting in St. Louis, which was live streamed, and actually the recording should be up either today or tomorrow, but we had 6 different panels on the day. But you know, to me, the most impactful panel was a panel of activists from Ferguson, right, who joined us to sort of tell us about their experience, you know, being in those early protests, you know, minutes after, hours after Michael Brown was killed. And I think one of the most important things they said was they each the chair of the panel asked each of them what they were doing right before they sort of became activated, right, before they became activists, and their stories were just so totally different. I mean, a couple of them were working at fast food places. One young activist talked about how she had planned to commit suicide either that day or just in the hours right before someone texted her to say that sent her a picture, or she saw it on Twitter, the picture of Michael Brown in the street. And to this day, she says Michael Brown saved her life. But they told some really powerful stories, and I think as people thinking about documenting this type of content, collecting this type of content, I think interaction with content creators and content owners, right? These are the people sort of putting these things out there that we want to take, really, to tell stories in the future. I think interaction with those folks, I think respecting their views about how they want to be remembered is really important. And we've done this. We've sort of built protocols around this for other types of materials that we've collected. And we have these rules and these policies for a lot of sort of the physical materials that we collect, but we've seemed to sort of, we've thrown all this out the window in a lot of ways when it comes to web archives or social media archives, because I think the vastness of it all sort of really pushes a lot of people away to say, well, there's too much stuff here for us to get too personal, and I think that's wrong. There are ways that we could sort of dig in and get to know some of the people building the content, creating the content around some of the subjects you want to capture. So I think that's really important.
I think, oh, sorry, if you don't mind.
Go ahead.
I think one of the ways, too, at least on Twitter and other medias where you're allowed to hashtag things, as much as we make fun of hashtags, they're a great way for the people involved to not only kind of give consent in some way to saying that I want this to be part of the discussion, but they're also a way to find that information, because those kind of do become more organic from the people who decide what the hashtag. I mean, we just sat here and decided our own hashtag. And that's what happens when people start talking about these things online. They make the hashtag. And then when they choose to use that, that kind of gives us, I don't want to say permission, but they know that they're part of a conversation then, at least. So,
right.
Yeah.
Right. Mary?
You partly addressed my question there, but what I'm curious about is for the people who are doing research online and among groups that are aware that researchers are maybe there, do you see any formal request from researchers for permission or announcements that I'm doing research, or does this all have to? What is the mechanism for securing permission? Is it going to individuals whose words and images you'd eventually like to use, or do you approach the group? It's sort of like the collective. Where is the agency of the collective located?
Well, yeah, in our web archives, it's the site owner. So there's no way we could possibly notify all the people that are contributing to those sites. So they have to act on behalf of their community, basically.
And you can post an informed consent document somewhere on the site, but there's no way to guarantee everyone is going to see it.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. I mean, it's really difficult. So we're thinking about sort of technical ways to deal with this with the Doc Now project, and also more sort of socially responsible ways, right? So one of the technical things we're talking about is, okay, so let's say you're collecting a hashtag. Generally, when people are using a hashtag to communicate online, they're generally sort of watching it happen as well, right? They're watching the conversation so they can respond. What if, as part of the tool, you could automatically send out information that actually uses the hashtag twice or 3 times per hour, right? Saying this hashtag is being archived, here's a link about the project, it's being archived by this university. So the idea is you're sort of putting information out there, and as part of that, that message, it could also be an opt-out message, right? This hashtag is being archived, click on this if you don't want to be included in the collection, right? Now, how this will all work, I'll leave that to Ed and people like Dan Chudnoff to figure out. But that's one of the things we're talking about. The other thing we're talking about is really, thinking about how do we communicate our values, right? So we're thinking about this idea of social media data labels, for example. So after you build a collection of social media data, can we come up with some labels that sort of specify a few actions that you should take while you're using this data, or how you should treat this data? So for example, you could have a data label that says, that this collection will only be around for 1 month from this date to that date, and it will be destroyed after that. Or this collection has a lot of images of minors, so you can only use it on site. And it can't be shared. So how do we sort of communicate our values about what we want the tool to be used for, how we want the tool to be used, and how we want the data to be used. Sort of in the absence of all the sort of technical ways that we could address that, the least we could do is can we sort of communicate our values to people about how we think the data should be used. So there are lots of ways to think about it, but it's really complicated.
If the key concepts of human subject protections involve confidentiality, consent, and protecting from harm, we can't always consent everybody. We can't always keep everything confidential. However, there are often things that we can do to mitigate the harm by taking out some of the identifiable data, by once you have collected the stuff, just protecting those who have posted it from having it be specifically identifiable to them.
Mm-hmm. Other questions? Joel?
Thanks. Maybe for all of you, but Bergis perhaps especially for you. Of course, archiving social media is still pretty new and moving forward in a new way. I'm wondering, though, if there are any instances yet of behaviors that have been influenced by the knowledge of archiving activities. In other words, do people who participate on Twitter suddenly develop a filter in any way once they're aware of the fact that there may be research activity involved with what they're doing, that's going to be kept in perpetuity in some way? Do you have any examples of anything like that where it's affected the spontaneity, the quality of what's happening?
Yeah, so a couple years ago when we started this project, I was thinking about just doing something really local at UCR. And I asked one of our professors, Nalo Hopkinson, who is a science fiction, really well-known science fiction writer, if we had a meeting about this and we chatted, and I was like, okay, so I want to collect all your tweets and I want to put it in an archive and all this. And the first thing she said was, well, if I knew you were collecting them, I would tweet in a different way. And so, yeah, I think, knowing that, your stuff will be sort of preserved for a very long time in a space, and other people may be able to use it to do their own work, I think that definitely will change people's actions as far as how they interact with the platform. And I think that's where we also have to be careful too as people building these tools, because I don't think Twitter or Facebook or Instagram or any of these places want whether it's social media archiving tools or whatever to be built. They don't want any of these sort of outside things to influence how their users use the platform, right? So we have to also be really careful about, for example, if we're going to send out these sort of messages using the hashtag, that Twitter will latch onto that and say, hey, these people are really messing with our thing here. And so I think that's a big concern, is about how people will change their interactions. But we see now that people are, as these platforms become really well established, Twitter's been around for 10 years, people are thinking about how they use the platform anyway. So we're seeing a lot of tweets being deleted, right? I mean, so you can collect a hashtag today and then a week later sort of run a test on it to see how many of the tweets have been deleted, and you see that number goes up the longer the data set's been around. So people are already changing their actions on the platforms even without knowing that they're being monitored.
Yeah, we have, it wasn't from this archive, but years ago we sent out an email, and sometimes the site owners publish that email to their website and say, oh, the Library of Congress is collecting me, isn't that great? And we did have one, I think it was a blog, where we had a ton of posts where people were saying hello to their grandchildren and, waving to the future kind of thing. But we haven't seen, major changes. I think they forgot about it soon after.
Yeah, I saw that a lot of times with online communities. You'll see an entire online community fall apart as soon as they realize that there's a lurker, or there's somebody that maybe isn't really a part of the community that starts commenting. This happens a lot on anti-vaccination websites. If they find a debunker comes in and starts posting, there's a very violent reaction to that person. But sometimes the reaction is that the whole community just falls apart and they go someplace else, or they disband entirely. So it really makes, things can really change as soon as somebody finds out that somebody else is listening in.
I've also observed, though, that sometimes they change just temporarily and then they go right back to normal.
Yeah, some of them do.
Did anybody see that news story about the model that posted a picture of a naked old lady at LA Fitness? What I think is so interesting about most of the coverage of that is that it's been excoriating this model for body shaming the woman with very little discussion about the complete breach of privacy, with the really illegal breach of privacy, but it's all about the body shaming. So I just think it goes to show how thoughtless people are about privacy right now. Instead, it's about other issues. People have kind of given up on privacy. I also wanted to suggest a more sexy hashtag for this conference. Since we're at the Library of Congress, and because Hamilton is really big and all over the place, how about something like "Not Your Founding Fathers Internet"?
That's good.
One thing I've often had to deal with over many years of doing research is embargoed material. Is there a way to embargo information?
We embargo 1 year. We've actually embargoed a lot longer because of other reasons. Just it takes us a long time to get things online, but we're collecting about 15 to 20 terabytes a month now, so in all of our collections, so it's just a lot of data to deal with. But yeah, the lawyers have suggested a 1 year embargo, which we follow. So we only have, you can actually get to some of these sites through our Wayback. Talk to me after if you want. I'll give you tips on how to do that. But you can only get through about a year ago. So we're collecting currently, but that's not available. Okay.
Hi, good morning. It's a lot of really interesting perspectives. I guess I'd like to ask, since there's an interesting combination of people on the stage, kind of from folklore and archives, which speak but not always together. And I am wondering, two of you are participating in IRB activities at your institutions. That's another relationship that I think has often been a little bit fraught with folklorists in particular, and speaking as an ethnomusicologist, I know that it's also been a relationship that people aren't always comfortable with because the practices are developed somewhat outside of our disciplinary practices. So I'm wondering sort of what perspectives you're bringing to the IRB and kind of what your experiences there have been. And I guess some of the things that I'm hearing the archivists say, I'm sorry, this is sort of a two-part question here, but so I'm kind of wondering what folklore brings to IRB. And for the archivists, I guess I'm thinking here more of people coming from information science, but in online culture, people are talking about participatory surveillance and things like that. Something's changing. All of you have said something's changing about privacy too. And I wonder if we're seeing something different with digital culture here. And so I guess I'd like to hear your perspectives on that.
IRBs tend to be populated by older, out-of-touch people that do not spend a lot of time online. IRBs really need people to join them and bring them into the future. But more folklorists need to get on IRBs. I have done a lot of work trying to educate IRB members around the country on qualitative research, just getting them used to things like the idea that you can't always give the IRB your exact list of questions because there's going to be follow-up questions that you don't know what they're going to be yet, that interviews in folklore are never completely structured. They're always somewhat semi-structured and informal to some extent. The more folklorists get in there and become a part of that board, the better they can make life for other qualitative researchers at their institutions. IRBs are so different at every university. My university has a wonderful IRB with lots of qualitative people on it and very flexible, open-minded people. That's not the case at every university. And it's really not fair because a folklorist who has a great project that would be highly encouraged at Bowling Green State University might run into a wall at another place just because the IRB is stuck in a different mindset. So that's why it's so important for more of us to not be so afraid of the IRB, but you can't beat them, so join them and change them. And with the digital culture, in the same way, bring them into the present, because many IRB members have no interest in learning about it, let alone making the right decisions about researchers who are doing their research there.
Yeah, I've had similar experiences where I'm not going to say anything bad about our IRB board, but things have gotten caught up for very silly, at least to a folklorist, reasons. Ours tends to be highly medical, and as someone who does medical research, I get tagged a lot for not knowing exactly how many participants I'll have, which is something I can't know until I start actually doing the research. But I've gotten held up for months at a time, and had issues based on things that are very minor compared to the major ethical issues I'm seeing. They're more worried about number of people, number of questions, those kind of things. So it is very true. A lot of these boards either tend towards looking at people who maybe are a little more out of touch with what current research is kind of happening, or they tend to be highly medical and are looking more at, are you drawing blood? Are you, and they don't quite understand, and in some cases too, I've had people say, oh, well, you're just asking people for stories. That can't possibly harm anybody. And I'm like, well, no, it could.
It could, yeah.
It absolutely could. So it very much depends, especially on the organization, the institution.
But something encouraging is that if there's a board that hardly has anyone on it that gets these issues, and then you get somebody from the folklore department or you yourself get on that IRB, like what happens to me is that our compliance officer directs most of those protocols to me. So I have a real chance to help qualitative researchers and to be the one that actually does get what they're doing and to make the path easier for them.
So, I think this surveillance thing is going to become a real challenge for archives, people who have been doing traditional archiving pretty soon. So when Ed Summers and I were collecting social media on Ferguson, and he posted about I think it was almost 14 million tweets that he had collected on Ferguson. He wrote a blog post about it and posted it online. One of the first people to reach out to Ed was a security firm, right, who had also been collecting on Ferguson, but they had missed that window that we had the data for. So they wanted Ed to share that data with them, right? And so, so people are out there watching, right? Law enforcement is watching, and we know that, when these tools, that law enforcement bill gets put into place, they disproportionately target poor people and people of color. That's just what happens, I think. No matter what the sort of reasoning is, whether it's about terrorism or whatever, whatever sort of the justification is at first to sort of justify the use of this stuff, it always ends up being sort of marginalized groups who are disproportionately affected by these types of tools. And so I think, archivists, we've been sort of operating in these sort of closed spaces, right? With paper records for a very long time. We sort of own that space. We sort of decide what happens in that space, who gets access. But as we move into this sort of digital space where really we're dealing with data, right? I mean, we call it archives and all this stuff, but we're dealing with data and metadata, and other people can tap into that. Right? We no longer have control of these types of archives that we're building. So I think we really need to think about, as we're building these collections of data, how we're going to protect people that are represented in there, and we're not even close to thinking about that yet.
All right, we have a couple minutes, and then we'll break. Does anyone have a final question or two?
This has been a great panel. I'm wondering how each of you can anticipate the future of technological development. We've talked a lot about Twitter and Facebook, but we don't know what's around the corner in terms of social media. Is that something that you're able to tackle or think about in your current work?
This reminds me that this past weekend I was doing an interview. I'm working on a book right now where I'm doing interviews that are long, in-depth, in-person interviews, and I don't record them because I don't have time to transcribe, so I just write it all down as we go because I type fast. So I told my interviewee that I wasn't recording, and he said, well, he immediately pointed out to me in the room we were in all the different things that might have recording devices in them. And he said, just because you're not recording doesn't mean like somebody, if they wanted to, couldn't be tapping into the microphone on my phone, on your phone, on that computer, and there. And I said, well, but why would they want to? And he said, well, you never know. Maybe not today, but in a few years we could have a government that does want to like watch everything we do, and they could be collecting all of it. And I just kind of went, whoa! Like I don't even want to imagine a world like that. I can't worry about that. But some people are very highly attuned to the possibility that we are moving into a world where we're completely under surveillance for nefarious purposes all the time.
Yeah.
Looks like there's a question.
I had a question about how different online spaces like Twitter or like Reddit affect privacy concerns. Like, so, for example, Twitter feels very much like a public forum, I think. It's similar to Reddit in that you have these sort of threads in which you're not immediately identifiable. You have a username, and you can post within that conversation. I'm wondering if within those spaces, some of the privacy concerns you have around being able to identify people or people's own posts and their thoughts as to what is private and what isn't. How do you sort of negotiate that given the different online spaces?
It depends on the sensitivity of the material and also how hard people are trying to conceal their identities. Because some Twitter handles, you can figure out who it is quite easily, and others you can't.
Yeah. I think a lot of people, especially who are more used to social media too, either divide their lives up into sections, so they have an official Twitter or official whatever, and then they have their sort of private one where they have name changes, they have more privacy protection on it. So I think people are dividing their lives up into little segments in different ways, and that's kind of interesting too, that we've started to know that we have a public persona, even if we're not a public person. You don't necessarily need to be a politician or a professor or anything like that to have a sort of public persona anymore. Everyone needs one now.
There's a great new book called Modern Love by Aziz Ansari, who worked with sociologists and psychologists to collect information about how people date and use texting and the internet in romantic life now. And one of the methods they used was they created a subreddit where they invited people to give a huge amount of material from their online dating lives. And I thought that book was not only a great informative book, but really innovative in its use of a social media platform like Reddit to collect data in a very voluntary way. And people always are much more willing to give us information than we fear that they will be. So we don't always have to worry about harvesting it and spying on them when there's so much that people are willing to give forth.
Great. Final thoughts? All right, thank you very much.
Welcome back. My name is Steve Winick. I'm the editor here at the American Folklife Center at the Library of Congress. And I'm here to welcome you back to introduce the next panel, which is going to be about the American Folklife Center field projects, which is something that we're really excited about. These are projects that went on from the 1970s through the 1990s, in which staff from the American Folklife Center, along with other field workers, went out and documented a wide range of communities across the country. And we came back with a huge archive of documentation, which is now being digitized and placed online. And that's the part that we're the most excited about right now, is getting this stuff out there for people to see. So the first person that I'm going to introduce, and then after her, the rest of the panel will come up, is Anne Hoog. Anne is a member of the American Folklife Center staff, and I'm very happy to say that I'm the first person who has the privilege of introducing her as our coordinator of processing, which is a job to which she's recently been promoted. So we're all very happy to have Anne in this position where she'll be having a great impact on the way all of our materials are processed from now on. But she's also been working very diligently on these field projects and making sure that they're getting up online. And so Anne's going to come up and talk about the background of these projects and what she's been doing. So please welcome Anne Hoog.
Good morning. Some of this presentation will be showing a sampling of the photos from various field projects, and a few slides just have some descriptive material showing an overview of what the field projects are and why they're a topic of a panel at this symposium. With the American Folklife Center celebrating its 40th anniversary this year, it is appropriate that we have a panel celebrating these field project surveys. These projects came to define the work of the American Folklife Center in its early days, and now with the opportunity to digitize these materials and put them online, makes them more widely available and promises to continue this work in a new way. This is one picture being tomato season. I thought appropriate to show the ripening tomatoes in the windowsill of the Lowell Folklife Project picture. So here's a timeline of the field projects in the order of when they first started in 1977, shortly after the center was founded, up to about 1999 when the last of these field projects concluded. These projects moved around from place to place, and each had its own focus and approach, from documenting ethnic arts or industrial heritage in a single city to exploring the complex cultural relationships of land and people across regions. There are differences between these projects. Most of them share certain characteristics that help define the nature of the field projects. They all used teams of field workers working together in the community, usually 3 to 10 or so, depending on the scope of the project. They all had an emphasis on professional documentation, creating high-quality sound recordings and photography, along with detailed logs and field notes. Attention was paid to a broad span of expressive culture, including the full range of everyday life, not just music and crafts, but celebrations, foodways, games, vernacular architecture, occupations, environmental issues, and more. Most of the projects included some level of cooperation with other local, state, or federal agencies, such as the National Park Service or state and local arts councils. And these projects all resulted in the creation of a large body of ethnographic archival collections as a product of the fieldwork. What is in this large body of ethnographic archival materials? The field projects have materials arranged into similar categories. Many of them are arranged by administrative documentation and publications and ephemera. The administrative category includes information about how and why these projects came to be, who was involved with the planning, contracts with the field workers, and release forms, etc. The documentation category for each project are the materials that were created by the field workers and photographers. In total, all field projects added together, the formats included approximately 140,000 black and white negatives, 95,000 color slides and negatives, 3,500 hours of audio recordings, 45,000 pages of photo and audio logs, 6,000 pages of written reports. These are just estimates, totaling nearly 300,000 items. The third category, publications and ephemera, includes primarily maps, brochures, and local publications gathered in the areas where the fieldwork was being conducted. It's the second category, the documentation category, that includes the items that have been recently digitized. So here's those formats listed again with the total digital memory needed, 21 terabytes. And if you're keeping score at home, that's 21 million megabytes. Digitization is now complete with these collections, and so we're now in the process of preparing items for online presentation. One project has gone up in its entirety already of the documentation category of the Chicago Ethnic Arts Project, and soon the Montana Folklife Cultural Survey will be going up. It's in test right now. We were hoping to have it up by now, but it's almost there. We're getting there. I often like to start with this short series of pictures to help define visually the nature of the field projects. I mentioned the teams of field workers with these projects. Often field workers would work in tandem with field workers, photographers, and recordists. This is Carl Fleischhauer with the cameras taking a photo of Etta Anderson of Osceola, Georgia, taken August 20th, 1977. And looking at the cameras he had, which would have been somewhat typical of the field project photographer, likely one camera had 35 millimeter black and white film, one had 35 millimeter color slide film, and perhaps another had 120 film, either black and white or color. Now, usually the field worker and photographer were matched up together while out in the community, and often both the field worker and photographer had cameras. This picture was taken by the late folklorist Beverly Robinson. And here's the picture that Carl was taking. And you can see off to the left, there's a bag sort of in the corner of that picture. That's actually Beverly Robinson standing there taking that picture of Carl. You can also note in this picture there's a microphone attached to Mrs. Anderson's collar, indicating there's an accompanying sound recording that goes with these photos as well. And so one thing that makes these photos so representative of the field projects is that in addition to documenting a community's traditions, what is also captured is the documentation process itself, the documenter becoming the documentee. So frequently you have teams of field workers and photographers documenting each other, photos of photos being taken, photos of sound recordings being made, and though inadvertent at times, sound recordings of the photos being taken, as you can frequently hear the shutter going off in the background, thus capturing the moment of documentation. The lens not focused on the informants in the field only, but also on the field workers and the part they played in the creation process. One important job the photographer had to do was also typing up notes. And this is very hard to see, but I just wanted to put one piece of paper up there as a sample of the materials that are in the collections and being digitized. And this is a log that Beverly Robinson typed up of what she was taking pictures of. And picture 6-6A there says Carl Fleischhauer taking pictures. Sadly, peach season is almost over in this region, but I love this photo taken by Lyntha Eiler. It is representative of the many wonderful food and foodways photos in these collections. So I've sorted through these thousands of scans of field project photos. Something struck me about them, that they don't just capture the objects of the food and of the vernacular architecture, but also that transmission of knowledge. And what defines these projects as much as the objects and the transmission of knowledge among the communities is the relationships and transmission of knowledge between the field workers and communities. There really isn't any way to conduct good field work and to create such rich documentary materials without a good trusting relationship with those you're working with in the communities. And so here's where these collections show the commitment to doing it right and how close these two worlds were to each other during these projects. To sharing and enjoying a story on the front porch, or playing fiddle tune together on the front porch. The deep interest and care in how things are made, and the source of knowledge and tradition represented in each tool that was used. In this case, the planter's peanut can. Sometimes you have to climb high on a government car to capture the cultural landscape. And sometimes you have to crawl into the weeds to find the more hidden things. And a part of each of these field workers' notes, here we go, taking notes in the field with the piece of paper you have in the field, and then returning at night to the office or apartment or hotel, wherever the field workers are staying, and typing it up. And this is the creation of the log and field work in action right here, creating the logs and field notes that are in the collection itself. So these are the materials that make up the field projects, what is in them, and a bit about how they were created. And as the discipline of folklife is, what we have here is not just the documentation of the cultural things, but the process of the creation, plus the process of the creation of the documentation. Here on this panel are some of the creators of these materials. And so this ends my part of the talk, and I'll turn it over to Betsy Peterson, who's going to introduce the panel and begin our discussion in more detail. And by the way, there'll be a slideshow going on during the panel that's illustrating some of the photos that some of these photographers and field workers took. So, thank you.
Thank you, Anne. I'm actually going to make very brief remarks because I do want to turn the discussion over to the people on the panel. I was in graduate schools, just starting graduate school when these projects were going on. And to me at the time, I certainly knew of them, certainly knew of their impact, and always kind of looked at them and the people who worked on them in awe. Over the years, I think these field surveys have sort of receded from people's minds, memories, et cetera. And I've realized a new generation that is coming up is really not that aware of a lot of these projects. And so part of what the digitization is all about is to really bring these back to really resurface them and begin to look at the work. And also, we hope a range of publications will come out of it over the coming years. It is a gargantuan task, as we're realizing, and not an easy one. And it's certainly going to take more time than we thought it was going to take. But a couple of things that I loved about these projects that we'll talk about more in detail in just a second is the teamwork and the teams that were assembled for all of these projects. They included photographers, and photography, I think, becomes a really significant part of this project, and certainly in terms of what is left behind for us to work with, it's really critical. These projects also hired professional photographers, which wasn't necessarily that common at the time. And also just the issue of client or sponsor. A lot of these projects were the result of collaboration between multiple federal agencies, usually federal agencies or state government. But we want to explore those issues as well, what those partnerships were like and how they came together. So with that said, I'll just bring up our panelists, and we are having Carl Fleischhauer, who, as I mentioned earlier, was the first employee hired by Alan Abour at the American Folklife Center. And he was very instrumental with Alan in shaping what these field surveys became. We have Terry Eiler and Lyntha Eiler, two of the photographers that worked on a handful of these field surveys and developed close relationships with some of the folklorists. And I think have, okay, yeah, please come up. Mary Hufford, a former staff member with the American Folklife Center, now in Virginia, at Virginia Tech, yes. And David Taylor, also former American Folklife Center staff, but current library employee, working in library services administration. And we'll just get started now. What I wanted to do is ask Carl, since Carl was there at the beginning, to just talk a little bit about what the thinking was. How did these come about? Why did they come about? And then we'll move on from there.
Okay, thank you, Betsy. And I start by a big gesture in Alan Abour's direction and a wave. To some degree, I'll be channeling I think what he taught me and his thoughts at this early moment. And so a tip of the hat, and if I get it wrong, you can pipe up in a little bit. When the center was launched in 1976, Alan, more than anyone, was really aware of the past precedents here at the library. They've been mentioned already a little bit, the many years, for example, in which John and Alan Lomax did field collecting themselves. And that was marked, among other things, by a sort of a surveyness to it. They went all around the country and sent people around the country. And they were really keen on using modern equipment, which in that day was instantaneous disc recorder. Alan himself, when he was head of the archive, which happened in the 1960s and ran into the early 1970s, did a certain amount of field work himself, and that was a period in which the two of us got acquainted. We found ourselves visiting a family named Hammonds in West Virginia and worked on a documentary project over there, and I think to some degree the way in which we collaborated suggested things about team fieldwork. I was an employee of West Virginia University in Morgantown at the time. We had a little micro team, you might say. We did a little bit of everything, each of us, but Alan tilted towards musicology, to be sure, and I tilted towards photography and family history. When the center got started, and here I really am channeling what I think I learned from Alan, is there were several important roles that the field projects played at the Folklife Center. For the library, it was a signal that we were still building collections, that like Lomax, this was about doing things that would bring collections back, and you've just heard the statistics about how significant that was. In the field of folklore and folklife studies, we were exploring methodology. I think as Lomax had with the disc recorders, we dragged those bulky Nagras around, and you got a glimpse of one in that picture of Beverly Robinson in Georgia. And the one real failure, which Mary Hufford and I have wrung our hands about, was it was a day before GPS. We drove ourselves crazy trying to map phenomena in New Jersey, but that technology wasn't ready yet. Today it would be an easy thing to map phenomena. And it's worth saying that this methodological development still continues at the Folklife Center in its current work. I really admire what John Bishop, who's here, and Guha Shankar are doing with this oral history project, which is using the very latest kinds of approaches for video recording and also builds the collections. For students in university programs at the time, and I guess that includes Betsy, these field projects offered some paying gigs for a few months and also let folklore graduate students or recent graduates have exposure to what we were up to and help us develop some of the methods and approaches that we were using. And for the center, one of the roles was to establish and nurture relationships with agencies. Anne mentioned a little bit the Park Service. We had several connections to the Park Service, but there were also connections to the Smithsonian, and directly and indirectly to the Arts Endowment through the state folk arts coordinators and other programs. So all of that sort of was the rationale, I think, in the history there. As has been remarked, the team dynamics are important, and we have plenty up here to help testify to that in a little bit. The one element was there were academic specialists who were part of the team. They tended to have certain specialties that were tailored to the projects. Chicago was about ethnic groups. The Blue Ridge included, for example, someone who was really good with quilts and fabrics. There were occupational topics that David oversaw up in Patterson and Lowell, where you get into both ethnicity and occupational. And in Nevada, we found ourselves, as we did in many places, deeply into vernacular architecture. Rusty Marshall was the director for a couple of those projects, and he's a real specialist in that. We also had a Smithsonian specialist in saddles. The second element, which Terry and Lyntha represent, were the media specialists, especially still photography. There were team members like Tom Rankin, who's also here, and Blanton Owen, who, alas, has passed away, who were very good at wearing both hats, academic specialist as well as photographer. But the photographers, to some degree, helped broaden the coverage, I think, by being more than the folklorists, sometimes focused on everyday life, and in addition to which, they would contribute by taking scenes that showed people doing X, whereas in a separate interview, the folklorist would talk to the person about how they did X, and you sort of have the documentation of doing as well as the discussion of doing that comes in. There's also the general visual context, I guess I would say, you know, the cultural landscape, perhaps for lack of a better word, the photographers tended to have a natural gravitation towards and so on. And so it builds a context in the documentation of place and a sense of place, and you saw that, and you're seeing it now with some of these scenes. The team dynamic involved a kind of cross-training, I guess is what I would say, where each of these folks with their own specialties tended to teach the others and back and forth. The folklorists often took photographs as well. You saw the picture Beverly Robinson took of me. You know, so it sort of worked back and forth that way, where it's possible that I helped Beverly with photography, more likely that she helped me understand African American culture in that context. And there was also things like the judgment of relative importance. In Chicago, it was sort of interesting. The Lena Berdunas, who is Lithuanian American, really helped us focus on these little wooden shrines that were being made by people in that community. And so that directed the photographer, also Lithuanian, to move in that direction. It's worth saying, as you've seen, that there was extensive use of still photography and fairly limited video and motion picture film. It didn't even turn up in Ann's tally, but in fact there was some video and some motion picture film. And I think our feeling at the time was that it made a lot more sense in a survey project to cover things with still photographs, which then could be selectively used. I have come to wonder today in a YouTube environment where little short clips have a place. Little short clips then didn't have a place exactly, and so today we might do more, but then it was still photographs, I think, that made that work. And Ann has already touched on the aspect of building the archive in the field with a picture of Dave Stanley or whoever it was at the typewriter. And when we started, there were not portable computers, so typewriters were what we had. By the time Mary and I got to trying to work in New Jersey, we drug out Cape Rose for the first time and used 5-inch floppy disks, but that was a first. Worth saying that the contracts with all of the workers required that their output be dedicated to the public. The idea was to thrust this material into the public domain, just the way the Farm Security Administration photos as government work for hire got thrust into the public domain. That goes against a little bit what gets taught in photo schools, and Terry and Lyntha are both you know, prominent in the photo school at Ohio University, where protection of your rights is sort of an important feature for most photographers. And we deviated from that, and I hope it's worked out well to people's satisfaction. Finally, there was a social dimension. We had shared living quarters for the most part, even though some people came and went serially, and it meant that you had like a college dormitory, a lot of exchange over breakfast or sitting in the lounge or coffee at the mid-afternoon or whatever. And that was a rich form of social communication, a social dimension there. So I guess I'll shut up and turn to Terry, Lyntha, and Mary and the team dynamic and how those things went.
Well, it was an interesting sleeping arrangement, to say the least. The team dynamics was very important, I thought, to us from the first project, the Blue Ridge project that we worked on, in that we found ourselves visual narrative specialists, Lyntha and I, and we knew how to tell a story about the people, the situations, the objects, the events, but we had not gained the kind of acute focus that the specialists were suddenly bringing to us, saying, you've got to pay attention to this. And it really helped us to broaden our coverage, but understand where the narrative would develop, so that there was a dynamic. I'll let Lyntha talk about the contract, though. That's fun.
Well, I think the first for the Blue Ridge was interesting because we had a 4-month-old child when we started the project. And so the contract addressed that we would have childcare. And so we went to Galax, Virginia, and found childcare. Unbeknownst to us, the woman that ended up doing the childcare had a grandson who was a big-time professional regional wrestler. So our son went to a lot of wrestling events. It was before little tiny heads, so when it may have damaged his hearing somehow. But it was interesting. It was a wonderful group. They were all, you know, we had child care during the day. On the weekends, we had a 4-month-old baby, and this was a 2-month project. But the baby was wonderful. We would go to a church service and come in with this 4-month-old baby who doesn't discriminate who's holding them, and the child would be passed around, and we got a lot of goodwill and cooperation.
Well,
calling this
access.
baby.
It was like having an access card in diapers. It was just fantastic. But it also meant that Andrew, ended up on Children of the Heavenly King recording right in the middle of it, letting loose some sort of a cry.
Yeah. Yes. And
Mary, how did you find working with photographers?
I was just thinking about how I found working with toddlers. Because during the New River Project, we had toddlers, and so we were out there, and it gave us that. I mean, we ended up, we knew every single playground really well by the time we left there, but it also provided a certain kind of access. I mean, we ended up interviewing and documenting kids jumping rope and doing, you know, in an African American community on New River, where there aren't very many of those. And no, but the child ticket is pretty good. The diapers aren't, but you know, anyway. Okay, the teamwork. I found it really. I mean, it was
you
formative.
can be honest.
No, it was formative. What can I say? To work with photographers, first of all, to have, if you're doing documentation and you're trying to do the photography and the recording and manage the social interaction of the interview, it's very, very difficult. And to have photographers working with you, they're not as you know, an extension of you, but as in dialogue with you about the material, about everything that you're doing, and in constant conversation. I mean, to be in the car, mulling over what we've seen and thought about, all of the insights that go in there. And as a folklorist, I came at this probably much more with an ear for language and an ear for stories and things like that. And I learned a lot about visualization and framing pictures and things like that from Terry and Lyntha. And I would ask Lyntha, could you please take a picture of these soil horizons just to show us how deep the topsoil, the A horizon is here and everything. And she'd be like, well, it's not going to make a very good picture. So we'd have to negotiate those kinds of things sometimes. But we did get the soil horizon pictures, and they were very, very
yeah, I did cooperate. I did cooperate.
Yeah, I know you did. Yeah.
But I'll break in and say, one time we were interviewing a coal and miner union boss, and we were in his home in the evening, and it was when I really realized that, you know, Mary was really thinking about what questions he was going to ask, what order, how she was going to frame this. And I'm scanning the room looking, where am I going to set up my lights? Oh my gosh, there's a gun sitting on the couch. So I didn't say, oh, you know, you can't say anything. And we go outside after the event, and I'll say, Mary, what did you think about the gun? And Mary's going, what gun? I didn't see any gun. But it was just, you know, I'm looking at visuals, you know, and she was really focused on this interview. And because we could divide and conquer, I'm sure she would have seen the gun if she had been out looking for photographs, but it was like, oh my gosh, okay,
Well, the other thing that was really amazing about it is if you have people with you who are dedicated documenters, you know, photographers, then they're going to worry about, you know, like when we went into that barber shop in Soak Creek, yeah. And Lyntha just came in with this big umbrella, and she just set the whole thing up and totally took it over. The barbershop was half the size of this stage, and she managed to do this. It was barbershop music being made in the barbershop, and that was incredible. But
the barbershop was lit by fluorescent, which we all know is a tool of the devil. And in real film, you had no option for clear filtration of fluorescence, so you had to overpower it in order to bring it around. Today, you throw it over to automatic white balance and the problem goes away.
But the thing is that in graduate school as folklorists, we learn to become very deferential to the informant, and you tread, it's like you take off your shoes to approach this burning bush. And here are these photographers who just come right in, and I remember Carl was with me in a New Jersey Pinelands project, and I introduced him to Robley Champion, and he says, glad to meet you, Mr. Champion. We're going to get every bit of this on tape and film. I mean, it was just like that, and people liked it. They're like, yeah, you're not wasting my time. This is going into the Library of Congress. That was really
two things
interesting.
I need to point out. One, we're getting to see some of these images for the first time since we photographed them, which is just really a treat.
Well, we just.
But secondly, secondly, when we worked for National Geographic, we did not work in the field with a partner. And I think many people feel that you do. The writer, at least in the early days, would be in the field second. Sometimes they'd come first, but usually they were coming into the field second. So there wasn't a collaboration of the sort that we saw in the Blue Ridge or down in the Coal River or the Blue River. So there was this wonderful idea of sharing the narrative as outsiders trying to become knowledgeable of the narrative we were building.
And one of the events that Mary and I were spending the night at Sybil's.
Sybil's Bed and Barn. That's where we
Barn.
stayed.
And in the middle of the night, Mary is going, we've got to get up. Because the miners that were also staying at Sybil's were out in the common area playing card games and watching Christmas TV shows, movies. And this was about what time?
Well, it was probably about 2 in the morning, and they were laughing uproariously, and they were playing a poker game called Pass the Trash. And so we're like, okay, we have to document this. We got up, and we documented and audio recorded, and it was.
I'm curious. Terry, Lyntha, and Mary have worked over a period of years together on 2 or 3, 4 projects, primarily in West Virginia. And I'm curious how your relationship or the interactions between you and with the subjects changed or matured or evolved over time.
You get on a iChat or a phone conversation, it's like listening to 2 sisters. I just kind of sit back, but that was one way it changed. They were sharing tales and stories.
My brother-in-law.
Right. But I think the big change was that in terms of the people we were working with in West Virginia, suddenly we had these shared contacts who would touch base with one or the other of us. We'd end up sharing that connection, and when a graduate student wanted to do a piece on mountaintop removal, I could send that graduate student to Mary. Mary and Lyntha could send them down to someone in Naomi or wherever we were working, and they had a built-in shared base from where we had started.
But I also think it's, Terry and I do a lot of projects together, and we'll stand at the same spot and photograph different things. And I pretty much know what he's photographing, and he pretty much knows what I'm missing. You know, and so then we'll try to, oh, he's not doing that. Oh my gosh, I've got to do it. but the same thing with Mary. After working over years, I pretty much have an idea of what she really will need. And, you know, so it was a nice give and take. I'm sure she would say, oh, Lyntha's going to need this. I need to maybe set up over here. Or I would say, no, I've got to put the strobes over there. You need to, you know, do your interview here.
And we went on to do some work following. After I left the library, we collaborated on a project in southeastern Ohio. It was a body burden monitoring project, but it was the same kind of thing. We really documented a lot of cultural landscape connected with, as a way of showing what was at risk for the community when its water supply had been contaminated by DuPont. The full range of cultural sorts of amenities and everything. Yeah.
Let me interrupt here just enough to turn in David Taylor's direction and ask, I mean, in a funny way, we've been hearing rural, and I think of you as urban with the projects in Paterson, New Jersey, and Lowell, Massachusetts, and perhaps elsewhere. Did it seem the same as these stories?
In terms of field work?
Well, or teamness, yeah.
Well, one of the great privileges of working on this type of project for me was the team dimension, the opportunity to get to know colleagues, to work with them intensively over long periods of time, and to learn their perspectives, particularly from team members who were trained in other disciplines. I worked, for example, with John Alexander Williams, a fine historian, regional specialist of occupational studies of the United States. We're still close friends, and it's been 30 years, I guess, we've been acquainted. But to learn his way of looking at things, and he was delighted too to learn from us. Well, how does a folklorist look at these things, which is his own turf in a certain way? And he was so enthralled with our perspective on documentary photography that he insisted that I teach him to be an ethnographic photographer, to look at things through the camera in the way that I would look at things. And then he would come and show me his pictures and say, what do you think of that, David? And he did a nice job, but that's the type of enthusiasm that was shared. And when you are in a, let's say, second-rate motel, sharing it with 4 or 5 other people for a month or so, you get to know these people because you're interacting at all the moments of the work and the leisure time. And you're talking about what's going on. What are the standards? This isn't what I expected at all, or this is great, the stuff that I saw today, which I didn't personally see because I was running around in another part of the landscape doing something else. And it was just so fulfilling to work with others. And Tom is here, and we worked together on the Lowell project, for example. Are we forgetting other people in the audience that worked on the field project?
Rita Moonsammy.
Oh, Rita, of course, yeah here. Anyone else? Yeah.
The ethnic language and heritage, which was a very different model.
Yeah, that's Frank Crochan, who has helped us out from time to time. Actually, and there's another, I'll ask David again, because he shepherded a project called Italian Americans in the West, which had people in California, Colorado, Nevada, Utah, and Washington. That must have been less of a team sort of a thing. I mean, that was like individuals and places.
There was one main team that I directed in several of these locations, but there are a couple of other ancillary teams, we might say, who were under my remote direction, working in places where I didn't personally go. There were, I counted them this morning, 20 field workers in addition to the AFC staff who worked on that project over a, let's see, 3-year period. So that may be the longest one, or certainly one of the longest ones that we've undertaken, with lots of people involved, including graduate students of Tom Carter's out in the West, and people from other disciplines as well as folklore.
I'm curious, I mean, a question for all of you. When you were working on a particular project, were you able to look at contact sheets or to go be hearing stuff as you're moving along so you could review and either correct course, or how were you having regular team meetings to talk about the direction, or how did all of that work?
Well, part of this was for all of us to work out what our roles were as team leaders or project leaders. And I learned tremendously from Carl and Mary and Alan, who had been involved in these projects before me. But I think all of us individually developed our own particular styles of doing this. I took it as my responsibility as the project leader to make life as easy as possible for my field workers, to make sure that the logistics were taken care of, that the hotel or motel arrangement was done by me for them, that they had a rental car, their flights were paid for, they wouldn't be out of pocket for anything, they had first-class equipment, they had a manual for how we wanted to identify the things that we were creating, the numbering for the field tapes and photographs and all of that. Plus, I would be there, and sometimes with an archivist as well, to answer their questions. And in some cases, we would have a preliminary training for the people on the team. One thing that I learned, somewhat to my surprise, that all folklorists and anthropologists are not created equal when it comes to fieldwork experience and training. So there became a greater need than I expected to train people in the standards that had been developed for the Library of Congress, the American Folklife Center, which led over time to the initiation of the Field School for Cultural Documentation that AFC has been sponsoring now for some years.
Betsy, I would chime in echoing some of what David said and remind everybody, including myself perhaps, that the client relationship varied tremendously, and in some cases, in fact, you really could figure out what kinds of documentation was needed in order to meet the requirements, in a sense, of the client relationship. So in Chicago, for ethnic arts, it's fairly easy. You know, there were 12 or 15 different ethnic communities, and you wanted to be sure you got something from all of them that represented the arts. What was happening in some of the Park Service projects was that the resource that was developed was intended to inform the interpretive programs, the park interpretation of regional culture. In the Blue Ridge, it had one character, but you know, in Patterson and Lowell, there was some of that. It had a rather different character. But I guess I would ask Mary, where we had another Park Service relationship in the Pinelands project, what is it that they wanted to learn, and how did we muster the forces to answer it? And it gets back to your team meeting question, because the more you've got a goals orientation, the more you could say, well, at the beginning, let's meet and list all of the things we want to be sure to cover. Then let's meet once or twice in the middle and check them off and see how well we've done and what we're missing. So in the final period, we can be sure to, you know, pitchfork people to get out and get the missing ingredients. But what is it that they wanted to know in the Pinelands, and who was it?
This was very interesting. Okay, did you want to ask more?
No, go on.
Okay, so I'm ready with what you, okay. Well, I think that, is this still working? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, I think that a real watershed event demarcating the difference between the earliest field projects and the later ones was the Cultural Conservation Report. I mean, that was in retrospect, that was an amazing thing to come in over the transom, you know, Congress to ask the American Folklife Center for a report on the government's history in approaching and stewarding intangible resources, intangible cultural resources. So that the Pinelands Project itself became a kind of a laboratory in which we could test the principles of the Cultural Conservation Report. Now, the Cultural Conservation Report came out in 1983, 4 years ahead of the Brundtland Report, which was commissioned by the United Nations and was published in 1987, and in which the acclaimed triple bottom line approach to stewardship was established for sustainability. You need social, ecological, and economic. That's the three-legged stool, but I actually think, and people now are proposing that there should be a fourth leg called culture, but I think culture is actually the seat holding the three legs together, but I digress. But anyway, so with the Pinelands Project, what was very interesting is that this was still in an era when everything was so siloed. Culture, environment, social stuff, it was all very siloed, and we were beginning to see the kind of crumbling of the silos, but they're still haven't been dismantled, but we're still working on it. So the Pinelands Commission anticipated in its report, or in its plan, management plan, working with the American Folklife Center. That was actually written in there. But culture was the caboose. It came along at the very end of everything, and we were expected to kind of like overlay tell the Pinelands Commission what to do with cultural resources in relation to a plan that it had already created. So that was part of what was going on.
I want to go back to your question, which is of team meetings, and make sure everybody realizes that if you were taking photographs using Kodachrome, an archival film,
black and white,
or black and white, getting it processed, you couldn't get together and look at the day's take. It was 7 days, 10 days later before the chrome came back. The black and white, if we got it up to Asman and proofed, we might get it back in 5 to 6 days. So those team meetings tended to be discussions over the notes that the photographers had taken, caption notes and information, and you weren't dealing with, look at what I gathered in terms of photographs. You were really used to working shoot and ship blind and keep on moving. You had to trust the tools that you were using in the field, know that you had the bracketing, the bracketing capability, the lighting capability, and could walk away and keep on moving.
Well, I'm curious though, for a couple of these projects, I know, say with Chicago, and maybe with the Pinelands, you were supposed to come up with a series of recommendations of how to do programs or why you need the justification for creating a state folklorist position or whatever. I mean, there's this very instrumental, concrete goal that you are supposed to inform. Was that the case with all of these projects?
Well, it seems to me not so much. And, to continue Mary's story, perhaps the point there was that it was a broad understanding of the cultural aspects of the Pinelands as an area, that needed description. And we always think of one space, many places is really a terrific model for that. In the Blue Ridge, the interpretive programs, in a way, were providing raw materials for scripts that the park rangers or interpreters would use, as well as perhaps identifying things that ought to be followed up on or, made more of. So again, those were sort of agenda-driven. In other cases, like the work we did in Nevada, in that small town in Nevada, it was more, I guess, seat of the pants, in terms of it. I mean, you worked on Park Service with Lowell. How clear was the agenda?
Well, Lowell, the Maine Acadian Project from 1991, and the Patterson Project were all co-sponsored by the National Park Service, various regional offices. and it was built into our agreement with them, cooperative agreements, that recommendations from the American Folklife Center would be forthcoming, particularly recommendations to the National Park Service about programmatic initiatives that we recommended that they would undertake to better interpret to the public the cultural resources of the region of the national park in.
And were those recommendations taken?
In some cases, yes. Some cases, no. It became out of our hands, and we moved on to other things. But I think we discharged our responsibility adequately.
It's an advisory function.
Mm-hmm. Right.
I mean, I think you're doing your best as an advisor. They seem useful. You know, before we go too far, let's look in Alan's direction. You've been the recipient of all of this verbiage. Do you want to actually pipe up and say something?
No, I think you guys are presenting it very aptly and usefully. I do have a thought, though, that I had talking about team field work, which I think really is an important subject, and a subject where we advance the state of knowledge of the professional field generally.
Alan, here we go.
Thank you. Now, I don't want to talk too loud. Is that all right?
Yeah.
Good.
Okay.
Good.
It struck me at an early point, maybe even as early as the Blue Ridge project, that an important thing that teams did is deal with community events that are large, multi-human events, you know, like a church service or a community festival. And teams are really, there's almost no other way to do it except with a team, because these events are such elaborate, complex human activities that one person is just inevitably can get just one person's perspective, but a team can really catch a lot of stuff and at least represent the whole of that thing. And so I think one important thing that we discovered along the way about having teams documenting local culture is that the teams could actually document cultural events that were larger human events than one person could do. Just a thought.
Okay.
Well, what about, before we turn it open for questions, what are we encountering now? And I know Anne can probably jump in here with, so here we have all this stuff. And how are we getting it up online? What are the issues and problems we're running into? And how do we want to see this material out there? I mean, the material is so varied, and it's an incredible kind of snapshot of the 1970s and 80s in America.
I wanted to just say, could I say one more thing about the client?
Yeah.
The Coal River Folklife project, as far as I know, was the only project in which the partner was not another government agency. It was the Lucy Brown Association for the Mixed Mesophytic Forest, a real civil society organization. And it was funded by the Fund for Folk Culture, and yes. And, but the thing is that we really got into the kinds of conversations that emerged from that. That really affected the project, that this was not a project conducted in order to make recommendations to another federal agency. So this was a project that over the years, as I've thought back on it, I've often thought of that question, or that statement often made about the American Folklife Preservation Act and the American Folklife Center when it was when Archie Green was lobbying for it. that it would amplify voices in a democratic polity, and often asking, how does that actually work? Where does that happen? Where does the rubber meet the road there? And with the Coal River Folklife Project, I thought back on how the images that Terry and Lyntha were creating were used to engage in conversation across the silos with ecologists who were working on forest decline issues, and we were documenting the community values of the forest. We presented the slides of people using forest resources in the southern West Virginia coal fields. At the end of that, the state forester approached me, and he said, "Hi, I'm William Maxey. That was really interesting." And he paused and he said, "You made those people look so dignified." And these were Lyntha and Terry's images. And of course, I was talking about customary uses of the land in a place where those are not highly regarded and valued and given much credence in public policy and so forth. I'm not going to say more than that right now. However, so several years later, William Maxey, who up until that point had stoutly denied that anything was wrong with the forest, resigned his position as state forester, and what he wrote when he resigned was very telling, because this meeting was in 1996. And he said, "I resigned as a matter of principle, for I did not want to share in the blame nor the guilt for the loss of West Virginia's heritage through the loss of our forested mountains." And he, somewhere else in his explanation, he explained that it was 1996 when he began to realize what was going on. And he started to put together that the heritage of forest was the same as the heritage of the culture. And to me, that's where this amplifying of voices in a democratic polity, that's one small moment when that kind of thing can happen.
Did those, just actually that brings up being a government agency and working only with, or primarily with other government agencies and doing the field research, how does that affect what you're getting, how you're shaping the material? Did you have a greater freedom to do certain things or no?
I don't know that I would describe it in terms of freedom. It had to do with the kind of conversation you would have with a client.
Yeah, to chime in, I think what was nice about the field projects and when they had client relationships was the level of independence. The Folklife Center may have been an advisory group, but it wasn't just a hired hand.
No.
And the other thing you can say is that in a way it's the glory of the archive, that then you have these raw materials which are malleable and can be reused by others in other ways now 40 years later. I'm reminded with all respect about the Farm Security Administration photos and Roy Stryker. If anybody thought that those were about the work of a particular part of the Department of Agriculture that had a job of helping farmers in a certain circumstance, and that the pictures were limited to that, you'd be badly mistaken. Once you open the archive to all of the pictures, suddenly you've got this kind of panoply of things. It's much broader than that. And we now have that vividly before us as the things go online. And I would say, as you know, for those who don't, I retired in April and quickly came back to the Folklife Center as a volunteer a couple days a week. And one of the things I discovered was the consequence of mass digitization is a mass of material that's somewhat undifferentiated or inadequately differentiated. And so I'm devoting a portion of my volunteer time to improving the metadata as best I can, to make it more digestible. I think at the moment it's semi-digestible and we're trying to get it to a higher level of digestibility. But the other thing you run into, and this goes back to the FSA, was before the photos went online here, there was 20 or 30 years worth of books published about it and highlights from it. So you had an interpretive stream that coexisted with the archival resource. And we've had some of that here. Mary Hufford is again a model for us, but David and I both have also worked on websites that are to some degree interpretive, that now coexist or will soon coexist with these massive raw material sets. And I think the usability or digestibility of these big archival collections is certainly strengthened or improved by the coexistence with interpretive materials. And we got more of it for some of them and less of it for others. Terry?
Well, apart from the fact you failed retirement like I did, we're going to see color, much like we did with the Farm Security Administration 30 years after the fact. We discover color, which was always part of the project from the beginning, but certainly not something easily shared. So it's a very exciting twist on where this goes.
Well, it's nice. Yeah, and we did. This is, you were joking about how you can shoot digital photos under fluorescent lights and not worry about it. You don't need to use both color and black and white film.
That's right.
You know, today in the digital environment, it's all color. You can take the color out and make black and white if you want, but the reason I look like a hardware store with all those cameras on me is because I was juggling black and white and color.
Absolutely.
But I do think the great treasure will be getting this resource online, but it will be, as I say, not as digestible as we would wish. So there will be some years now of trying to improve that, both through metadata remediation and also through adding a few interpretive layers here and there, which might be a book.
Yeah.
You know.
But with good metadata, because I'm always surprised when I find my pictures with bad information on them online, bad resource connection, interpretation, and I tend to send notes to people saying, not nice things.
Do you foresee the this? We're maybe shifting into the what now?
Okay.
You know, but do you foresee the use of the creation by independent agencies or whatever of toolkits and interfaces with all of this data?
Well, the education resource people who are part of the Library of Congress actually do a bang-up job with all kinds of materials the library has online, making teacher kits and stuff. So there'll be some of that right here at LC.
But I'm thinking beyond LC.
Well, I hope so.
I think
That would be the hope. I mean, we would like to get this material up and out. We certainly have ideas of wanting to create different products, or whether it's books or manuals or whatever, but we also do want to encourage other people to use it. And I mean, now 40, 50 years later, I would love to see how people would engage with the material, what they would think of it, how they would shape it and put it out. But with that said, I do want to open it up to the audience now. I know we've got, I think, about 15 minutes left or so before we break for lunch, but I didn't know if there are any questions for our esteemed panelists.
Great.
Oh, okay. Yes, Rita.
This isn't so much a question, and it doesn't
You should introduce yourself as a veteran of our project.
Absolutely.
Veteran, yeah. I was the field coordinator for the New River project and also was working for the State Arts Council in New Jersey during the Pinelands project. And in both of those roles, then I was participating in and observing the kinds of collaborations that were necessary to execute these projects beyond the federal government, and the consequences of them on both the products and the response to or the use of what was requested of the center. And I will say, particularly in New River, we were asked, supposedly the point was to develop recommendations for a cultural heritage center. And we did produce a report like that, but the dynamics of the local and the state partners that we had resulted in something completely different. in New Jersey, we had a set of state partners using the materials, including the photographs, for something that the Folklife Center hadn't planned, but which then went on to be very useful and impactful for state and local audiences. At the bottom of this, though, is my strong impression of the way that those partnerships on the local state level could be fraught. And I just wanted to know if Mary wanted to describe some of the kinds of fences that we had to jump over or couldn't get around.
In New Jersey, or oh, you mean on New River? Oh,
New River or New Jersey.
well, the New River is very interesting because
New River was much more complicated that way.
it's very complicated, and Alan said it was an example of edifice complex. No, the problem is that the Denver Service Center came to the Folklife Center and asked if we could help them do the documentation required to establish the foundation or the rationale, raison d'etre for the a cultural heritage center at Grandview. But there was a lot of ambivalence about actually building something from the Denver Service Center point of view. There was also the state and local, well, it was more a state-federal kind of a problem too, because the state also wanted to build what eventually became Tamarack, which did what Superintendent Joe Kennedy at the time said he wanted to do for the park. He wanted to bring them in off the interstate and shear them like a damn sheep, is what he said in a meeting. And the state, and then the state swooped in and did it. So, but the thing is that what we were recommending wouldn't have required anything more than a trailer. And that's not what they had in mind. We had an interpretive program that was really fueled by insights from lots and lots of conversations with communities along New River. We wanted to work with communities to establish their own kinds of buffer zones, really, areas where they could meet the public, so they could have their own exhibits, and we would do that. That's what we really, plus using lots of things that were already in place. The local radio station, the local TV station, the churches, the fire halls, you know.
And it would have really served the various cultural entities and practices of the people there, whereas what was eventually constructed was serving the turnpike service.
Well, Tamarack, the local name for it is the crown of thorns. It's got this, it's got all these spikes coming out the side that are supposed to be an architectural interpretation of a quilt. Okay. But they call it a crown of thorns, which has its own ironies.
Are there any other questions? Yeah, Chris.
Hi, how are you? My name is Chris. I work at the Brooklyn Arts Council, so I'm a folklorist in Brooklyn, and I'm lucky enough to work in New York State, where there's several folklorists throughout the state. And when we do get the opportunity, which is very rare, to work together, we do, it's a wonderful opportunity to learn from each other. And so building on that, something you had mentioned about teams, and how it's an opportunity to see the different training styles, the different approaches are different. Could you talk a bit more about some things that you maybe, that when you worked on teams, that you learned from each other and exchanged ideas?
A couple of things come to mind. One, as you've heard, I work at Ohio University, and I have taught documentary photography there for several decades. And the end result has been that an awful lot of my students go on to get PhDs in visual sociology, anthropology, and folklore, understanding that they have a media obligation, but they don't want to be part of journalism. They want to be in another area. So what I think we learned was the idea that an ethnographic look at something is very different than a journalistic look at something. And that there needs to be a shared value. Teaching Mary journalism was as much fun as her teaching us about physical architecture. Rusty Marshall was fantastic at getting us to look at the physicality of what we were photographing.
What would have been the journalistic approach? I mean, you
I'm
make
trying
a
to get people
distinction.
to turn up the currency, the
Mhm.
news,
Okay.
what journalists would call news value, but what is in the current vernacular that's important. It's ginseng season. Yes, we're going to go out and photograph ginseng, but let's go talk about the economics of it. Let's talk about the.
Oh, okay. Do you see a distinction between ethnographic and journalistic photos?
Not the
of
way I used to.
but it's this summer we teach a workshop in Scotland, and we had students and trying to push them out on a project and make it more culturally based. So they go in and they do this picture of somebody like this, and I'm going, no, I want to see what's behind them.
Put them in an environment.
I want to see their stuff, and how they place it in the room. And you can still make an environmental portrait of them where they're big, but that you can still see this whole event behind them.
A relationship of sound.
I guess I would, I'm sort of reflecting on my own experience. I've learned a lot from the folklorists with whom I have worked. So part of your answer is, maybe it's just specific to me. Like Terry, my familiarity with vernacular architecture was fairly low, and thanks to working with Rusty and Blanton and others over time, I think I've sharpened my sense of, at least rural buildings, perhaps more than urban buildings one way or another. In Chicago, the revelation was interesting in a different way. Having worked with Alan in West Virginia and sort of being involved in documenting the Hammonds family, which was this sort of Cecil Sharp would have felt right at home, coming into their house. We got to Chicago, and you have this much, much higher level of self-consciousness on the part of ethnic communities and how they costume and present themselves. And it was quite interesting, and in a funny way, having come from the Hammonds, it seemed false to me in this odd sense. And by the end of the project, partly because of getting an earful from Elena Berdunas as we went along, the idea of people's self-expression is their self-expression. Your job is to document it, not to quibble with it or something. So that was quite a helpful revelation. In Nevada, here again, it's sort of like the Rusty Marshall angle. It was quite interesting working with Dick Albarn from the Smithsonian to get into some of the nuances of saddlery. I didn't know about the degrees to which you have a California-derived Spanish tradition for a certain kind of saddle that has a single cinch. And the marker of it is how, well, first of all, it's whether you call it a lariat or a riata. Obviously, they're coming from the same Spanish word, but in Nevada, it's a riata. And you don't tie it hard and fast to the saddle horn, you wrap it around, or dally, as they say, on the saddle, which goes back to having a single cinch instead of two cinches and so on. So there's whole business about methodology for cattle handling as it relates to the tools. Well, from a photographic point of view, that suddenly gives you an ingredients list, of stuff to be sure to cover. But the other dimension in Nevada, which I don't know, I'm not sure when it hit me, but there was also, back to the self-consciousness of presentation. The main rancher we documented was, I think, had carefully thought through what he felt being a buckaroo meant and what it came to. And he would actually stage these events. When we first arrived, he threw what he called a buckaroo breakfast, where he had this antique chuck wagon and an open fire and so on. And what you began to sense slowly but surely was that his view of the work and the life had somehow been amplified, if you will, or reinforced by looking at Charlie Russell paintings, which he had done, probably Hollywood movies, John Ford. I mean, all of those things begin to reinforce themselves, and you get this echo in there. but I'll credit myself with that small insight rather than learning it from somebody else. But the salary I got.
Your question reminds me of the critical importance of the composition of the field team at the earliest stage. How do you decide who you need? In one case of the Paterson, New Jersey project, I was very fortunate in being able to hire a very highly qualified folklorist who is a native of Paterson, Tom Carroll. And the benefit to me was he could take me deep into the community based on his own experience there and give me that kind of background. So it was a tremendous, rare, invaluable deep dive into the cultural heritage of that place because we were smart enough to hire someone like that. In the case of the Maine Acadian project on the northernmost border of the state of Maine, responding to the National Park Service request to document Acadian culture as it existed in that region, we decided, I think it was Alan and I decided, that a great person to bring into that project as the on-the-ground team leader was a person not with great familiarity with Maine culture, but who was in fact a Cajun from Louisiana, who had that natural interest in this whole other branch of Cajuns in the far northeastern corner of the United States, Ray Brasser, who was perfect and a French speaker as well. But you need to think hard about that. Everyone can contribute. What are the contributions do you need?
Frank, and then Alan. Oh, sorry.
I just wanted to ask about the absence of video, and particularly from the standpoint of the library folks. Is that something that you regret to your grave, or is that something that you thank God you don't have to deal with the legacy formats?
Black and white, color, and video. We tried video in the Blue Ridge. It was an interesting experiment is the best we can call it. With today's tools, it would be a piece of cake in comparison.
Yeah, I agree. It's a little like the GPS stuff.
Yeah,
it would be doable in a way it wasn't then. The video equipment that we had, which Terry's referring to, is a single tube video recorder that had a lot of smearing in the picture afterwards, so the quality of the documentation is not so hot. But again, I would say these were largely survey projects, not entirely, and I think there's something that makes a good synergy between still photography, which are these many isolated instances, and a survey of things. What you don't get, you know, and of course your own experience is terrific with this, is you know, visual documentation of music and dance, or some of those forms of expressive culture. And in the Blue Ridge, we were trying to get some dance and so on. We did shoot some movie film in Nevada, but I don't regret it. I think, again, having 140,000 photos or whatever that total number is online is going to be a really valuable resource for people in a way that the video wouldn't. So I have no regrets myself.
But part of the documentation, too, particularly for the latter of the field projects, was to accept the donation of homemade VHS videotapes of family reunions and other kinds of things that happened at the community level. And people often asked us, well, I've got this, don't you want it? How come you don't have video cameras? Well, and I would said something like what Carl said.
Talk to him.
But Carl used to great advantage Les Stewart's home videos in Paradise Valley, Nevada, you know, which added, I think, immeasurably to that project.
Right, right, and with Guha's help, we're redigitizing them at high resolution.
Right. My other...
Oh, Guha? Oh.
You have
I
the
just
floor,
have
Alan.
one trivial point. You introduced Carl as the first employee of the American Folklife Center. Maybe my memory serves me wrong. I'm getting old, I grant you. But I think actually the first employee was Paula Johnson. And Paula is now a curator at the Smithsonian, but also Carl's wife.
Well, she is indeed. We also should remember Carol Armbruster, who pitched in at the beginning as well. So I was the first one you reached way outside and drug in. Maybe that's the better way to say it.
Smart hiring practice,
Yeah.
though.
Well, we got videotaped, just to return to that thread, we were videotaped on Coal River by people who were videotaping our interviewing and documenting. You know, they were just people from the community who did that. They had the video cameras and we didn't.
Guha's got a point.
So wanted to ask, direct this question towards David. I mean, the panel has been fantastic in terms of talking about the cultural legacy of the field surveys, but that stopped at a certain point in the 20th century. 1997, I think, was the last one. How did the center then take those methodological practices in particular, which I'm really interested in, forward in terms of informing the field, a wider audience perhaps, about the wonders of doing ethnographic in a team-based field work? Can you talk to that a little bit, David? I'm speaking particularly about the field schools, I guess I would say.
Well, there are multiple ways. The Field School for Cultural Documentation is one way that our practices in the field projects was codified through the teaching that we did, and the amalgamation of the ethnographic perspective with the archival perspective was made part of that as well, in a package for instruction of 2 to 3 weeks program that we sponsored in collaboration with colleges, various colleges and universities around the United States. A good deal of that, I believe, is represented on the website or is certainly shareable to anyone who's interested. Things having to do with archival numbering systems, which is something that I began to learn from Carl. How do we share that information? And I think I still have a photocopy of the methodology that you developed. And then the evolution of the technologies. I remember working with Doug Dinatelli, who has a great head for archival practice, in combination with new forms of media, the computer, for example. And he modified Carl's document to take that into account, I remember, as well. So how much that is made available outside of the field school, you can tell me better than I can tell you.
Yeah. Oh. And then.
Well, yes, I do. I would start the history of diffusing our experiences beyond our own circle with the equipment loan program, which started very early. We had all these NAGRAs, and professionals in our field didn't have them, and so they wanted to borrow them, and we just made them available. And Carl was the locus of made them available. But Carl, in a way, was part of the bargain because you got him as a kind of an instructor and guide, helping you not only with how to work the machine, but how to do good field work, or at least other ideas, our ideas about how one might go about doing field work. And then Carl moved on from that to a kind of a moving workshop on field work, field documentation, and the equipment and how to use them. And then it moved on to the later things that David is talking about. But I'm through.
Okay. I'm sorry. There's a woman in the back there. Who has a question? You, or in the middle.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I'm not a card-carrying folklorist like all of you, although I am a consumer of what you do. And I've been sitting here all morning thinking there's this strong Elysian quality to everything I'm hearing you say. Oh, sorry. And so my question is this project over? Is it completely done? I mean, this is kind of following up on the last question.
Well, I mean, when we talk about the project or the projects, these were a series of discrete projects that were done over a period of years, and on some level, I would imagine some of them were a little opportunistic in the sense that, you know, Alan or whomever saw potential for a project. There was a sponsor, someone who wanted to work in collaboration with the Folklife Center to do something. I think most of the projects developed or emerged in those ways, so maybe a little bit serendipitously. I know the Nevada project was a little bit different, and some of the Coal River project might have been a little bit different in that regard, in the sense that AFC pursued those more intentionally, and it emerged out of other work. But are they over? I don't know. I mean, field survey projects may be done again. It would depend on resources, partnerships. It would definitely require, you need local, state, regional partners to make these things, you know, work, as well as money. But
yes, actually continue to request your help?
Well, that's an interesting.
Is the Park Service still on the board?
Well, yes and no. I mean, yes, the Park Service has generally been on the American Folklife Center has a board of trustees, and we have one trustee here. But the appointments to the board are made through various channels. The president appoints an individual or appoints 4 individuals from federal agencies with like-minded or relevant interests, and the Park Service is usually, I think, appointed through that. I mean, we've always had an appointment from the Park Service. Sometimes it's the head of the Park Service. Sometimes it's a senior official in the Park Service who is appointed by the director. At the moment, we do not have anyone from the Park Service. Yeah.
I guess maybe I can jump in here and say that
it's a longer, I think, conversation. But
in the days when we were collaborating with the Park Service, and Alan and others can certainly correct me if I'm wrong, my memory doesn't go back as far as theirs does. We were there as sort of experts brought in to do this kind of methodological piece. If you look at the Park Service now, they have their own ethnographic and cultural documentation teams that are on board. They actually have a division of that of the Park Service. So whatever Park Service sort of initiatives are being undertaken are done under their own auspices and not necessarily with external agencies like ours. And that might be interesting to think about what happens in the field surveys at the state-by-state level. Lots of states do their own field surveys. Now, they don't necessarily rely upon us, although we're all in the family, kissing cousins, however you want to phrase it. So I think that was sort of to the heart of my question to David was, how does our methodological practice go beyond just the projects that we undertook, and how do they inform the rest of the field in some ways? And I think Roby Cogswell and other people up in Tennessee might be prime examples of people who came up imbued with the methodologies that we taught and applied them in their own sort of context without necessarily a direct linkage to the Folklife Center. So.
And I'd say one more thing is that there are other models of doing ethnographic projects and of receiving the documentation that comes out of those projects that we've explored more since then, and we have there are certain things that the government thinks that federal agencies are particularly good at or particularly appropriate for, and for that reason we have the Veterans History Project now, we have the Civil Rights History Project, which are 2 different models for doing ethnographic interviews of various kinds. And we also have things like the Occupational Folklife Project, where we help fund projects of folklorists out in the world who want to do these kinds of projects. And so we're continuing to be involved in the process of you know, advising and designing these kinds of projects. They just don't look exactly like the ones that we did from the 1970s to the 1990s. But these kinds of projects where we're still getting large-scale ethnographic documentation are still going on.
Excellent, yeah. Alan gets the last word.
Well, this is a nice moment to celebrate the sort of person at the administrative level in the Park Service, in this case, who is totally unsung otherwise. And now's my chance to sing his praises. I think a huge factor in the Park Service thread that we spun was not just that we had the Park Service on the board, but that there was a representative at a high level from the Park Service named Ross Holland. And Ross Holland was very sympathetic, very engaged and friendly. It wasn't his specialty, you know. I think lighthouses was his specialty, you know. But he was a good guy and a friendly administrator who supported all these things, who knew who to talk to in the Park Service to dislodge something or get something going. And so now I've had a chance to sing his praises.
Thank you. And thanks to everyone else, and I misspoke earlier, we actually do have a short session coming up here right now, a talking shop sort of dialogue with Doug Boyd and Nikki Saylor. So thank you.
So at the Folklife Center, we embarked on a 3-year planning project for the archives, and we're in the 3rd year of that. And we declared sort of 6 strategic directions that we wanted to focus on. And one of them was providing access at digital scale. And so what you see with the with the field projects is an example of us trying to scale up our access to materials. We're doing that with metadata. We're bulk uploading, you know, tens of thousands of records for our Cordell collection. And so anyway, this thinking about how to make oral histories and various spoken word materials accessible online is of a piece, right? So this is really something we're thinking a lot about right now. What we do is a bit old school. We'll put up a PDF or a text piece that goes along with the AV material. Of course, we want to get into the world of time stamping and synchronizing our metadata. And so to talk about that, thought immediately of our friend Doug Boyd. Doug Boyd directs the Louis B. Nunn Center for Oral History at the University of Kentucky. He's also the coordinator of a wonderful tool called OHMS, and he'll talk about that, but he'll also talk about his experimentation with voice to text and other methods of trying to scale up this kind of work and sort of the ethical implications that come with sort of blowing it all out there and how to sort of strike a balance between giving the access that people in the 21st century want against our responsibility as stewards of this material. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to Doug.
In the interest of being quick, efficient for lunch, I opted for no slides so that I could also then vague book or subtweet my entire presentation. Hashtag oral history wants to be heard and watched. Hashtag archives should enhance access for impact. But remember, hashtag sustainability. Hashtag ethics at Taylor Swift 13. The Nunn Center started in 1973 collecting oral history. When I took over in 2008, we had a collection of 6,000 interviews. Mostly analog, mostly untranscribed, almost no metadata. We had no public interface. I was the single staff member, even though they called me a director. And despite this, we still bragged that we had 500 researchers using our oral history collections every year. So one of my great obsessions, I think, over the past many years has been that there's these great oral history collections all over the world, but especially here in the US, especially in Kentucky. I think we have 43 different repositories that have oral history interviews within them. But the majority of those oral histories are continuing to be sitting there on the shelves and unused. Even if they've been digitized, they're very, relatively speaking, unused and still rather obscure. And that's not why we went into this business. We went into this business to document, not for obscurity, but for impact, right? To put these individual stories, to document these cultures. That said, AV Archives, all of AV Archives has the problem of discovery and usability, right? It's time-based media, it takes time to use. We have a complete reliance on text in this model. Text enables discovery, really. There was a point in oral history's history where it was actually seen as the only outcome. Columbia University actually erased their tapes after it was transcribed, which, they greatly, they reject that now and regret it. But the model, even if you didn't erase your tape, the expectation was we're going to transcribe this, and these are going to go on a shelf, and people are going to use them. And then they got digitized, and people are going to search them. The majority of reference requests that would come into my shop would be for transcripts. Just send me the transcript. We don't have a transcript for that. Oh, and there's awkward silence. So we've got this powerful dependency on transcript. Very few of us can actually afford transcription at the scale of even a small archive without a grant. And so without grants, if we factor out grants, if we were a startup, this would be a situation that potential investors would actually call a really bad business model. We're collecting on a scale like never before. Our discovery and interfaces are really designed for photographs. And so the usability factor falls pretty short when you use systems like ContentDM or other popular systems, not to call out just them, to use audiovisual type of materials. So in 2008, 2009, I started drawing on napkins and working with programmers and created a system called OHMS. It's the Oral History Metadata Synchronizer. It was built for in-house only. It was really built to, originally, to connect users to the moments in the audio or the video. So you search on the word bourbon, it takes you to the moment when the master distiller talks about making bourbon. Originally, it was designed just for transcription, connect you to just the moment. Very simple. Then we actually had the financial crisis of 2009, and as the person who was paying the bills realized I couldn't afford transcription and therefore couldn't afford to use my own system. We put a little investment into creating an indexing feature where it was a lot like the old school tape logs that you've been seeing on the screen, where could we create a way where we could take indexing, abstracting, logging, and make it interact with the players. And so we did just that. We launched the indexing feature in 2011, and since then have really been primarily indexing our oral histories. We can index, just to describe what that means, from my perspective, you basically listen to an interview, you hear something important, often correlating with a question prompt, and you tag that moment, and with each index section, you can have a title, a partial transcript, a description of what's being talked about. You can use keywords and subjects. You can upload thesaurus to actually drive the keywords and subjects. You can put in GPS coordinates so that the user can then actually hear someone talking about some place and see that place on a Google map simultaneously. You can also hyperlink out to photographs. So that's actually the part that really people have really started to get excited about, or just the little GPS and the hyperlink thing we kind of just tossed in there. But the idea was to create a system that wasn't a new content management system. I sit on a lot of these grant panels. It drives me crazy when people propose a brand new content management system. Let's just make the ones we have better and rally around together. And so OHMS actually was designed to work with any content management system. So whether you're WordPress or Omeka or Content-EM or the Digital Library of Georgia, it works the exact same way. So I'm not going to get too far in the weeds in terms of how it acts or how it is implemented, but the values that I think drove the entire conversation here where we want to model, I want a model that's effective, affordable, flexible, interoperable, empowering, and sustainable. So, you know, the grant business, you know, is fantastic. With a grant, with a great, even a small grant and a programmer, you can actually achieve magical innovation. But what happens is inevitably the grant will run out at some point, at which point magical innovation tends to fall away and we fall back into unsustainable archival workflows. And so we're trying to actually come up with a model that reverses the trend. And can we actually create a baseline expectation of archival processing for oral history collections, or access models for oral history collections that have magical innovation built in, but don't require a grant in order to implement. And we've done that. So in addition to the Nunn Center, I think there's over 250 OHMS accounts now in 18 different countries, which is cool. All because it's effective, affordable, flexible, interoperable, empowering, and ultimately a sustainable solution. We have continued to innovate after the grant ran out. I'm pretty excited. Last month or 2 months ago, we launched the capability to do bilingual. So you can actually index in 2 languages, and the user gets to search or toggle between the 2 languages. You can actually upload a transcript and a translation, and it does the same thing, which is pretty cool. All without a grant, which is cool. So the Nunn Center has really rallied around this model. For us, it works amazingly well. We have a discovery system that's pretty basic. But because of the use of this system, what's happening is pretty transformative. Again, I remind you, we used to brag about 500 people using our collections in a year, and now it's averaging 10 to 12,000 a month all over the world. I think it was January, that was like 17,000, which is not perfectly meaningful, but is pretty incredible in comparison to from where we've come. So cool models are starting to happen where, you know, my center is indexing on a large scale. That means I've got 5 graduate students indexing all the time. But we're also having more professors from around campus start to get excited about this. I started to experiment myself using OHMS indexing as a classroom activity for my classes because I was developing the tool. But now professors are starting to actually latch on to this and realize that indexing is really a deep engagement for students with this oral history material. It extends beyond the sort of consumer model of student, go listen to this oral history and learn. They're actually participating in a creation or a creative act, and the archive gets free labor. So we have student classes at institutions around the country now that are actually indexing our collections for us, and it's pretty fantastic. So there's a pedagogical aspect, but, you know, and really I think the Nunn Center has about 2,500 interviews out there right now in the OHMS system. We're about to hit 10,000 total interviews, so that's about a third of our collection is now accessible via this interface, which is pretty exciting. Let's see. We do think a lot about some of these other systems out there. So OHMS really is something that we built selfishly for ourselves. We got the grant to make it open source and free through IMLS. But really, you know, I'm most worried about, you know, what system represents the archive that I'm running. And so we've scaled up in a big way and learned some lessons. Not everything, I knew this, but I've just been really reminded almost monthly, not everything needs to be online right now. And so fighting this impulse, aggressively fighting the impulse of archival obscurity, you know, to the other extreme of suddenly we've got all this stuff online. You wouldn't believe the takedown requests that we're getting now. It's really astonishing. I'm so jazzed about discovery. I'm so excited that, that more and more people are using our materials. But it is interesting. I love the calls. Hey, I found my grandfather, great-grandfather. I've never heard his voice. This is great. But also getting calls like, what the hell? You know, I had no idea my life story was going to be, you know, bullet pointed to that degree of detail and be the #2 search hit via Google when you search my name. I'm applying for jobs. What's going on? Had a call just a couple months ago from a woman. Totally innocuous interview. I mean, it's a great interview. There's nothing in there that anybody would really possibly think would be problematic. And the reality, I called her. I said, do you mind if I ask you some questions why you want this taken down? Because all she gave me was this vague, I'm reevaluating my privacy, my online privacy. And so I called her and talked to her. She's dating. And she said 2 men actually quote back to her from her oral history interview in first dates. And she said, that's not supposed to happen in a first date. And I said, I agree. I'll take it down. And I think that's a great example. I have all kinds of examples of somebody, you know, from one of our projects who's HIV positive, and now he's on the job market and he doesn't want people to know that. And at the time he did this interview, he really wanted to talk about it. But now he doesn't want it out there and have it be the #2 search hit when you're searching Google. So we've had to really step back, I think, pretty profoundly and think not just about informed consent, because we really need to do a better job of this, because no matter what we're saying to our people right now, it's not enough, the people that we're courting. And I know we can't fully capture the breadth of all that can happen to your interview, but we need to do a better job and strive to do a better job with informed consent. We need to do a better job with informed accessioning too. Our archives need to know what we have in these things. And so one of the reasons we've really put a lot of emphasis on indexing is we're able to identify those things, because indexing requires deep engagement and thinking about the content, not just mechanically transcribing something or even automatically transcribing something. I'm the same as everybody. I would love to have automatic speech recognition be the greatest thing. Right now, it is challenging for oral history for a variety of reasons, which we can talk about. But it also disconnects the human element from the process. And there's nothing more personal than this oral history thing, I think. It's not historic photographs from the 30s. This is somebody's life story. And when you take a good oral history interview that says, where were you born? Let's talk about your parents. Where did you go to school? You get their email address, you just reset their bank password. We need to think about this thing that we're collecting and the implications of it down the road. I think we've solved a lot of the problems here on the back end. Now we need to think about the implications of our solutions.
Great.
That was quick.
Yeah, come on over.
Sit here?
Sure.
All right. Do we sit this close?
Sure.
Okay.
I can move over if it's weird. Okay. So the American Folklife Center sent out some spoken word materials to participate in a project that the New York Public Library is doing with the Pop-Up Archive and Moth, right? So they're sending a lot of spoken word materials to Pop-Up Archive, which then turns it into text and brings it back to you. So we participated in an experiment with our materials, and it actually turned out decent. I mean, it's not bad. But so for people who are managing large oral history collections, what kind of advice do you have for looking at that, looking at OHMs, and sort of carving a path?
Well, I think that there's a lot of systems out there that do a lot of different things, and you know, one of the things I like about OHMs is that I don't have a dog in the fight. I don't really care actually if anybody uses it. I mean, other institutions. You know, it's something that we gave away, but we love using it in-house, and I'm excited to see it empowering other archives. But what it's done for us is pretty transformative. I think just from the perspective of indexing, we indexed last year 900 hours of interview in a single year for my student budget. No grant, no special initiative, My student budget was about $16,000. Now, we don't pay very well in Kentucky, our students, but for $16,000, we accomplished what would have cost us probably $180,000 in a transcript model. That's pretty revolutionary for us. And so we are now putting most of our emphasis on that. And I think a lot of people are doing is sort of thinking about this as an index now, maybe transcribe later, or maybe we clean up the automatic speech recognition that really still, even when it's pretty good, requires a lot of attention and care and feeding, I think, in order to bring it up to standards with regard to having it be a verbatim transcript. But I've really started to rethink my views on that.
Yeah.
I'm starting to think about transcripts less and less as the thing and more as just descriptive metadata. And when you make that paradigm shift, it removes the burden of perfection completely. So we're going to start experimenting with the idea of taking some of the ugly, automatically generated speech to text material and kind of make it searchable but not readable. Make it part of the search, because some of it can be really bad.
But hide it, right, on the interface.
But hide it. Make it searchable, hidden, but make it something that then can maybe connect to a corresponding index point. So we're thinking a great deal about that and starting to experiment more and more with speech recognition. I love the idea of it. The idea of automating the whole system, you know, is something that I think makes me somewhat uncomfortable from a usability or from a ethical standpoint of not knowing what we're putting out on the internet when we do it.
Right. I mean, I think you touched on it briefly, but yeah, how do you navigate that tension between scaling access to this materials and also being responsible stewards? And it would seem like indexing does give you a certain amount of check, right?
We've created a system, you know, I called it informed accessioning, and it's basically 6 questions that I used to have all my interviewers ask that basically all boil down to, is there anything I need to know about this in here? And if this were your story, would you mind it going online next week? And
so you asked that during the interview? Or
the interviewers are asking themselves this question when they write out
when they're working on an interview.
Yeah, and they're turning in paperwork for our interview and kind of telling us, hey, you need to look at this. But I started having the indexers do it, because we started realizing that we have all this legacy content that's not being collected yesterday or tomorrow that we have very little metadata for. And again, repeatedly finding really profound examples of people talking about very personal things that just have no business being online, or actually having, you know, being quite problematic if they were to go online. So building into workflows where all the indexers, you know, are closely considering these questions, I think has really done a good job. We're teetering on the brink of potentially being, you know, overwhelmed if suddenly we had an influx of new projects. And we brought in 600 some interviews last year, which is about 500 or 600 is now our average. And much more than that would push us to the point where I would need far more staffing to be able to have that closely curated, hands-on, really conscientious approach, which I think is worth retaining for sure.
Well, so that leads me to a question about the future plans for OLMS and how you're going to keep it sustainable or make it sustainable.
Well, I mean, it's really popular, so I'm really excited about that. But you know, but that's the key. It needs to be more about, not about us. And so we're creating kind of a Jedi Council. I don't know what to call it yet, so I'm calling it that. Of institutions who have bought into it big. Yale. University of Georgia is really into it big time. Brooklyn Historical is into it. But really basically creating a consortial group that's going to decide and drive development. You know, we went ahead and made it bilingual. I think there's I'm taking ideas right now because I'm reaching the point where it's time to apply for another grant. And I think, and I'm kicking around the idea of actually having, you know, and I think this comes from my visit with Kevin and talking about Kevin Bradley, who you're going to hear from this afternoon, but really having a desktop presence, you know, that's local, doesn't require media to be streaming, so that people can index restricted material and feel safe about it, but also have the interviewers, and this is me always thinking about workflow and efficiency. If I can have interviewers who are indexing material offline before it even comes to the archive, and I'm accessioning material that has this level of structured metadata. That's a dream. Yeah. So that's kind of where I'm leaning right now.
Cool. All right. We have time for just a couple questions.
I think I can talk loud. Now I can talk softly. Could you just step through exactly, like if I gave you a tape, what would you do? Do you use Dragon Speak or something to recognize the
Right.
words?
No, so we're not actively formally using speech recognition. First, we digitize the tape in accordance with best practices, and we'd accession that tape. But at that point, let's say you just had a name written on that tape, and we didn't know anything about it. Maybe we knew it was part of a civil rights project, but that's it. That's all we know. So at that point, if it fell into the queue of things that we were going to put online, it would go there, and we would index that interview. So somebody would listen to that interview, and while they're listening to that interview, they would be typing, and they would be tagging those moments. This is a major subject transition, tag, and start typing. And then, rather than transcribe, because we really don't know what's in there, and I can't afford to transcribe everything we bring in. And so at that point, we get a good sense for what's in that interview. Then we make the decision. Then we'd actually write the description of the interview, because now we know what it's about. And then we'd actually make that decision. Do we press the button and make it go live to the internet or not at that point? That's a good question.
Let me ask about a parallel activity and have you talk a little bit about what synergies there may or may not be. In broadcasting, as you may know, there is now, partly due to the Federal Communications Commission rulemaking, a push towards what's called time text.
Yeah.
And as people put their broadcasts online, time text is essentially text with markup language in it that, tells you what the timing is. It's a standard that came from the W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium, and then it was further standardized by SMPTE in the United States and EBU in Europe. So it's a way that will now come into the way broadcasts are synchronized. Is there anything about that that is helpful to you or vice versa? Or
Absolutely.
talk about that a little bit. That'd be great.
First, I want to say you're only slightly less intimidating now that you're retired. Right. I think when we first started on the OHMS journey, it really bugged me that there wasn't a good reference point for that. And now that we're pretty far into it, one of my obsessions is how can we connect it to a greater standard with regard to time and text. And so that's definitely something over the first year. That's one of the first mandates, really, of the Jedi Council. The people who we've put together. I shouldn't have said that publicly. Sorry, but basically the group. That's one of the top priorities. Is how can we take this now and fit it better into standards that are starting to emerge. And that's the one that everybody's talking about, really. At least in my circle that we're all talking about.
Each of those would reinforce each other and so on,
Yes.
and you'd get broader adoption and so on. I mean, it's what we dream of when we talk of standards. Too often it doesn't work, but sometimes it does.
Right. Hashtag motion JPEG 2000. We've got to get that one too. But I think if we can really, I really am not a fan of reinventing the wheel, and that's one of my frustrations with digital humanities is this impulse to create something nifty and cool, but again, not sustainable, not something that has necessarily broad appeal. And so we really have to, I think, work together, and rather than reinvent the wheel, really start to connect. So that's right in line with where we're going with that.
I wanted to ask you, this may be a little tangential, but a lot of cultural heritage archives are using crowdsourcing in order to do transcriptions, and I see that with natural history, I see that with cultural materials, see that with sociological stuff, but what is your experience, or do you think there's a future for crowdsourcing in audio recorded interviews or oral histories?
I think particular oral history is where I have an opinion. And a strong opinion, and that's really a lot of our material. If it's going to be transcribed, we don't know what's in it. And I have a real discomfort necessarily turning what I don't know is in there out to a crowd. Also, I have a discomfort opening up the way my collection is going to be described to people who actually are commenting on news stories about the presidential election this year. You know, I mean, anybody just opening it up and saying, you know, now there are certain ways we can actually vet that automatically, but there's certain ways we can't. And so I'm a little nervous about just opening the doors to that. And so I'd rather have sort of a curated form of that. Also, you need the crowd. And transcription is not a fun act. No matter how you video game the experience, I think, you either need to make it so partial that it's not a big deal, and so it's like the CAPTCHAs with the home addresses, you know, or you need a crowd that's just so massive. And so I don't have that crowd. That I can walk into a room and get people excited about indexing, because it's actually fun, it's actually engaging. And that's why we're getting all these students doing it in classrooms. We're starting to experiment with volunteer groups who are stakeholders in a particular project, who are going to actually play a role in how this project gets represented publicly. But to just sort of open the doors wide, it's not really what I'm leaning towards right now, because of the nature of our oral history collection and because of sort of the trust arrangement we have with the people who were interviewed originally, or a trust relationship that the interviewer had, but then gave the collection to an archive that doesn't have that trust relationship. So we're trying to be good stewards of this process on my end. Someone's going to take OMS and do that. They're just going to open up the doors and turn it into a true sort of crowdsourcing platform, and I think that'll work pretty cool. But you know, I like what NYPL has done with their transcription tool, for sure. I think if you haven't messed with it, it's super cool.
Yeah.
And we're over time for lunch.
We are. So we'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.